A bullet tore through Damon Cross's shoulder the moment he stepped between the gun and the woman who had saved his life. Blood bloomed across his white dress shirt as the woman he had planned to marry, Serena Vale, socialite philanthropist, the love he thought he knew, stood 10 feet away with her fingers still on the trigger. Behind her, servers loaded with stolen billions blinked in the darkness of an abandoned foundry while armed men closed in from every shadow. Lena Hart, the broke waitress who had risked everything on a handwritten warning, now held the only key that could stop the theft. But first she had to survive the next 60 seconds. If you're hooked, stay until the end to see how a paper napkin note ignites a war between Manhattan's elite. Drop a like and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The champagne was Cristal, the oysters were Kumamoto, and the lies were perfect. Lena Hart balanced the silver tray against her hip and wove through the forest of tailored suits and couture gowns crowding the private dining room at Aurelius Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant. The kind of place where a single table reservation cost more than Lena earned in a month. Her feet screamed inside discount flats that had already logged 12 hours. Her lower back throbbed from trays heavier than her dignity. The corner of her apron was still faintly damp from where she'd scrubbed red wine off Carrara marble after a hedge fund manager knocked over his third glass and didn't even bother to apologize. But she smiled. She always smiled. That was the job. Invisible was good. Invisible meant tips. Invisible meant she might actually make rent this month, assuming the utilities didn't get shut off first, assuming the transmission on her 10-year-old Honda didn't finally give up the ghost, assuming the collection agency stopped calling by the third ring instead of the ninth. She caught her reflection in one of the gilt-framed mirrors lining the east wall. Dark hair pulled into a ruthless bun, pale skin that hadn't seen real sunlight in months, shadows under her eyes that no amount of concealer could fully hide. 29 years old, and she looked 40. That was what working doubles did. That was what giving up did. 3 years ago, she had been halfway through Columbia Law, top 15% of her class, a summer associate position lined up at a white shoe firm, a father who was proud, a future that glittered. Then her father got sick. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, the kind that moved fast and didn't care about dreams or tuition payments or anything except devouring everything in its path. She dropped out to take care of him, burned through her savings, worked 3 jobs, watched him fade anyway. Now she was here, serving people who didn't see her face. Lena. Marco, the floor manager, materialized at her elbow, his voice urgent and low. VIP room. They need another magnum of the Krug. The good Krug. And don't screw it up. This is Damon Cross's table. Lena's stomach tightened. She knew the name. Everyone knew the name. Damon Cross, founder and CEO of Cross Industries, a software empire that had reshaped cloud security and artificial intelligence before he turned 30. Net worth estimated somewhere north of $12 billion. The kind of man who moved markets with a single public statement and made rival CEOs sweat in their sleep. At 34, he was already the subject of 2 unauthorized biographies and 3 Harvard Business School case studies. And tonight, he was celebrating. She retrieved the Magnum from the wine vault, $2,200 a bottle, more than her rent and car payment combined, wrapped it in a white linen napkin and carried it toward the VIP room at the back of the restaurant. The door was frosted glass, etched with gold, flanked by 2 security guards in dark suits who looked like they bench-pressed small cars for fun. One of them held her gaze for a moment, then stepped aside. The room was smaller than she'd expected. Intimate. A single round table beneath a crystal chandelier surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the Manhattan skyline like a living painting, the Empire State Building glowing amber to the south, the bridge lights strung across the East River like scattered diamonds. 6 people sat around the table and the room smelled of cedar and citrus and old money. But Lena's gaze went straight to the man at the center. Damon Cross was taller than his magazine covers suggested, easily 6'2", with the kind of broad-shouldered build that spoke of actual athleticism rather than the decorative fitness of men who only gym for photographs. Dark hair perfectly cut. Sharp jaw. Eyes the color of slate, quick assessing the kind of eyes that had learned to read rooms before they entered them. He wore a charcoal suit tailored so precisely it seemed painted on a pocket square the color of smoke, and no tie the single concession to the evening's celebratory mood. But it was his smile that surprised her. Warm, genuine. The kind that crinkled the corners of his eyes and made him look almost boyish, younger than the man who appeared on financial magazine covers with an expression like a sharpened blade. He was smiling at the woman beside him, Serena Vale. Lena had seen her face in Vogue Vanity Fair every society page in the city. In photographs, she was merely beautiful. In person, she was architectural porcelain skin, platinum blonde hair, swept into an elegant chignon bone structure that could cut glass. She wore a champagne-colored gown that shimmered with every breath and a diamond engagement ring on her left hand that probably had its own insurance policy. Her smile was radiant, practiced the kind that had been refined over decades of charity galas and board meetings and rooms full of people who expected her to be perfect. Tonight was their engagement party. Ah, perfect timing. Damon's voice was rich and textured, the kind that commanded boardrooms and made shareholders sit up straighter. He gestured toward the ice bucket. We were just about to toast. Lena approached the table, hyper-aware of every step, every breath, every inch of space between her body and the furniture. She positioned the magnum and began the careful ceremony of opening it, thumb over the cork. Slow rotation, the soft exhale rather than the vulgar pop. To new beginnings, said someone, a silver-haired man in a navy suit. To partnership, added a woman in emerald silk. Damon raised his glass toward Serena. His expression for just a moment was unguarded, open in a way that looked almost painful on a man who'd spent a decade building walls. For saying yes, he said quietly. Serena's smile didn't waver. To us, she murmured. Lena poured, moving clockwise. She had learned years ago to make herself part of the furniture in moments like this, present, but not intrusive, efficient, but not rushed. The furniture didn't overhear conversations. The furniture didn't notice things. But she noticed things. She had always noticed things. It was what had made her a good caregiver, a sharp law student, and now perversely an excellent server. She was filling the fourth glass when she saw it. Serena's hand, the one resting on the table beside her untouched champagne flute, was trembling. Not dramatically, just a slight, barely visible quiver in the fingers, the kind that only appeared when someone was exerting enormous energy to keep the rest of their body still. Lena had spent 2 years caring for a dying man, learning to read every micro-expression, every involuntary signal. The tremor in Serena Vale's manicured hand was the body telling the truth that the face had been hired to deny. Serena was afraid. Or furious. Possibly both. Lena's gaze flicked upward. Serena was still performing, smiling, leaning into Damon's arm, laughing at something the silver-haired man said. But her eyes kept darting. To the door. To the windows. To her phone, which sat face down on the table between the bread plate and the cristal, waiting for something with the patient tension of a held breath. Lena finished pouring and stepped back. Will there be anything else, sir? Damon turned toward her mid-sentence, and their eyes met for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Lena to feel the full weight of his attention. It was like standing in front of a spotlight, focused, searching, the gaze of a man who had learned not to look at people without actually seeing them. Then he smiled. He reached into his jacket, produced a money clip, and counted out $200 without fanfare. For your trouble, he said. You've been excellent tonight. $200. Groceries for 2 weeks. A fraction of her electric bill. A fortune and an insult at the same time, and she was grateful for both. Thank you, sir. Enjoy your evening. She turned to leave. That was when she heard it. The voice came from just outside the VIP room door, close urgent, dropping beneath the ambient noise of the restaurant, the way a stone drops beneath water, low enough to be missed, precise enough to carry. Transfer codes are on his phone. We move at 11:15. Make sure he doesn't leave the building before then. Lena froze. The voice was male, clipped, professional, practiced in the particular flatness of someone who had trained themselves not to sound nervous about terrible things. Then a second voice, softer, female, unmistakable. I'll keep him here. Just make sure your people are in position. I don't want any mistakes. The world tilted. Lena was standing 3 feet from the frosted glass door, half hidden by a decorative silk screen, a $2,000 magnum of champagne in her hands, and she had just heard Serena Vale philanthropist socialite fiancé give an operational order. What about the staff? The male voice asked. A pause. Then, with a flatness that made Lena's blood feel like it had been replaced with ice water. Collateral damage. No witnesses. Lena didn't think. She moved. She slipped through the door into the hallway. Head down tray clutched against her chest like a shield. Her heart. A drumbeat so loud she was certain the guards could hear it. Behind her, she heard Serena's laugh, bright false, the sound of a woman playing a role with absolute commitment. Lena made it to the service corridor and pressed her back against the cold wall, gasping. Transfer codes. 11:15. No witnesses. This wasn't a robbery. This was a setup, a hit. A conspiracy years in the making, wrapped in champagne and a diamond ring, and Damon Cross had no idea he was sitting at the center of it. She looked at the clock above the service station, 10:58 p.m. 17 minutes. Her hands were shaking so badly, she nearly knocked over a rack of clean glasses. She steadied herself against the wall and tried to think. She should call the police, but what would she say? She'd overheard a conversation. She had no proof, no recording, no names. She could legally attach to the voices. And Serena Vale was Manhattan royalty. Her family had been on the boards of hospitals, museums, and city committees for 3 generations. No cop was going to take a waitress's word against a woman who'd just been on the cover of a charity gala program. But if she did nothing, Damon Cross was going to die. Maybe everyone in that room was going to die. No witnesses. Lena looked down at her hands. They were still trembling. In her right hand, still held by habit, was the cheap ballpoint pen she kept in her apron pocket, the kind they gave away free at banks, the kind nobody ever thought about. On her wrist was a smear of ink from earlier in the shift. She grabbed a cocktail napkin from a passing tray, folded it once, then again. The pen felt enormous in her grip. She wrote 5 words. Then she folded the napkin into a tight square, tucked it into her palm, and walked back into the lion's den. Uki. The VIP room was louder now. The champagne had done its work, tongues loosened. Laughter sharper, the formal architecture of the early evening giving way to something more unguarded. Damon was standing, his jacket-off tie loosened, gesturing with both hands as he told a story that had the silver-haired man in stitches. He was animated, alive, radiating the easy confidence of a man at the peak of everything he'd built. Serena sat beside his empty chair, her smile perfectly calibrated, her eyes on her phone. Lena approached with the water pitcher. "Refills, sir?" Damon turned toward her still mid-sentence, and that was when she did it. She stepped forward deliberately, carefully, and let her foot catch on nothing. The pitcher tipped. Water splashed across the white linen tablecloth and onto the edge of Damon's sleeve. He jerked back, startled, and in the single second of contact, his hand steadying her arm, her hand brushing his, she pressed the folded napkin into his palm. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry." She grabbed a towel from her apron, dabbing frantically her face, a full performance of mortified professionalism. "I'm so sorry, sir, I don't know what happened." "It's fine." Damon's voice was calm, steady, but his fingers had closed around the napkin. She felt it. Really, no harm done. For one fraction of a second, their eyes met. Not the polite transactional glance from before. Something else. Something that passed between them with the speed and silence of electricity arcing between 2 points. Lena stepped back, bowed her head, retreated. Behind her, Serena's voice sharp and low. "What was that about? Nothing." Damon's tone was easy, dismissive. "Accident." Lena didn't look back. She walked steadily through the main dining room into the service corridor and halfway to the staff lockers before her knees buckled. She braced herself against the wall and let herself shake. She'd done it. The message was in his hand. "Your life is in danger. Trust no one here." Now she just had to hope he believed a waitress. The clock on the wall read 11:03. 12 minutes. The lights went out at 11:07. Not flickering, not a brownout. The entire restaurant plunged into total darkness, and for 3 full seconds the world held its breath. And then the screaming started. Lena's first thought was fire, but there was no smoke, no alarm, no smell of anything burning, just darkness and the rising tide of panic from the dining room chairs scraping glass, shattering voices colliding in the dark. She grabbed her phone, activated the flashlight, and pushed through the service door into the main hall. Chaos, guests on their feet shouting, crowding toward the exits. A woman was crying near the bar. A man in a tuxedo was trying to navigate toward the front door with his arms outstretched like a blind man in an unfamiliar room. Silverware clattered. Someone knocked over a dessert cart, and the sound was like a minor explosion. Then cutting through the noise like a blade came the sound she'd been dreading, the front door slamming open. Footsteps. Heavy coordinated moving with the particular rhythm of people who had done this before. Lena flattened herself against the wall as three men in black tactical gear, faces hidden by balaclavas, compact submachine guns carried at low ready, moved into the dining room with the calm efficiency of a military sweep. One of them fired a 3-round burst into the ceiling. Plaster dust rained down. "Everybody down, hands where I can see them now." The dining room dropped. Some people dove under tables. Others pressed themselves to the floor and covered their heads. One of the gunmen moved to the entrance, blocking the exit. Another swept toward the bar. The third spoke into a radio clipped to his shoulder. "Main floor secure. Moving to secondary target." Secondary target. The VIP room. Lena moved. She sprinted down the service corridor, past the wine vault, past the prep kitchen, past the dish station, her heart hammering so hard she felt it in her teeth. She could hear boots behind her now, voices coordinating, someone shouting her in rapid bursts. She hit the VIP room door and shoved it open. Empty. The table was abandoned, chairs overturned, champagne spilled across the white linen in spreading amber pools. Serena's phone was gone. The money clip. Damon's money clip lay on the floor beside an overturned chair as though it had been knocked loose in a hurry. No bodies, no Damon, no Serena. He'd read the note. Lena's breath came in ragged bursts. Where had they... A hand clamped over her mouth from behind. She screamed into the palm a compressed, airless sound and twisted hard, throwing an elbow, but the grip was iron expert, unmovable. A voice hissed directly into her ear, low and absolutely controlled. "Don't move, don't make a sound." She froze. The hand released her. She spun. The man was mid-40s, built with the kind of functional density that spoke of years of operational work rather than gym vanity. Graying hair, close-cropped. A face that had filed away whatever softness it once possessed and kept only the useful parts. He wore a dark suit and an earpiece, and his eyes were the color and temperature of a winter ocean. "You're the waitress, Ma," he said. It wasn't a question. Lena nodded, mute. "Reed Knox, head of Mr. Cross's security." A glance passed her toward the corridor. "You gave him the note." "Yes. I heard them. I heard Serena. I heard what they were planning. I know." His expression didn't shift. "Mr. Cross is already moving. We're extracting him through the kitchen. You need to come with me." "What? No, I need to..." "You're a witness." His voice was flat with finality. "Which means you're a target. Move. Now." He didn't wait for her agreement. His hand closed around her elbow, firm, not rough, and he pulled her toward the back of the VIP room through a service door she hadn't noticed into a narrow maintenance hallway lit by a single emergency strip. They moved fast. Behind her, from the direction of the dining room, she could still hear the occasional bark of orders, the sound of frightened people trying to become as small and invisible as possible. She understood suddenly and viscerally the appeal of that strategy. The kitchen was pandemonium. Chefs crouched behind the steel prep counters. Sous chefs had pulled the walk-in freezer door shut, and she could see pressed faces through the small window. Pots and pans scattered across the floor knocked loose in the initial chaos. An industrial mixer was still running, obliviously blending something in a stainless steel bowl, and in the center of it all, standing with his jacket shed and his sleeves rolled, was Damon Cross. Up close, without the performed ease of the engagement party, he looked different. The boardroom polish was stripped away, and what remained was harder, more compressed, radiating a cold and controlled intensity that had nothing to do with wealth or success and everything to do with the fact that someone had just tried to kill him. His jaw was set. His eyes moved, constantly processing, calculating. Beside him, a second man in a dark suit had a phone pressed to his ear and was talking in rapid, clipped sentences. Damon's gaze found Lena the moment she entered. Something shifted in his expression, not softness exactly, but a recalibration. Recognition. You heard them, he said, not a question. Yes. Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. Serena was talking to someone outside the door. They said they needed transfer codes from your phone. They said 11:15. Her throat closed around the last part. They said no witnesses. His jaw tightened. A muscle jumped just below his cheekbone. Where is she now? I don't know. She was in the VIP room, but when I came back, it was empty. A burst of gunfire from somewhere in the restaurant. Closer this time, sharper. The sound ricocheting down the service corridor cut her off. Reed's hand went to his weapon. We need to move. Service exit, now. They moved. Reed in front, Damon behind Lena, the second security man covering their rear. Through the kitchen past the industrial ovens with their residual heat around the steel prep tables to a heavy metal door stenciled with emergency exit, no re-entry in faded red letters. Reed kicked it open. Cold air hit Lena's face like a slap. February in New York. She hadn't been outside in hours, and the temperature difference was violent. They were in a service alley, narrow, dark, lined with commercial dumpsters and stacked milk crates. 50 feet ahead, a black SUV idled at the alley's mouth, exhaust curling in the cold. Go, Reed ordered. Damon moved first. His hand closed around Lena's wrist, and he pulled her forward not roughly, but with an urgency that allowed no negotiation. Her cheap flat slid on wet pavement, and she stumbled, but he didn't let go. They were 10 feet from the SUV when the emergency exit door behind them exploded open. 3 gunmen spilled into the alley, weapons up, moving fast, spreading to cut off angles. Reed spun and fired. The sound in the narrow alley was deafening muzzle flash, strobing the darkness, the crack of gunshots echoing off brick walls. One of the men went down. A second dove behind a dumpster. The third raised his weapon. Get in the car! Reed roared. Damon shoved Lena at the SUV. She hit the rear door hard, yanked the handle, dove in across the seat. Damon followed a half-second behind, slamming the door, and before it latched the driver, a woman with short, dark hair and eyes like hammered steel floored the accelerator. The SUV rocketed forward. Tires screamed against wet asphalt. Lena was thrown back against the seat as the vehicle fishtailed at the alley's mouth, the rear end swinging wide before the driver corrected with practiced ease. Behind them, gunfire cracked in staggered bursts. The rear window exploded inward. Safety glass showered across the interior in a cascade of tiny cubes, and Lena screamed a short, reflexive sound, and then Damon's arm was around her shoulders, pulling her down, covering her with his body, as 2 more rounds punched through the bodywork with sounds like heavy hammers striking sheet metal. The SUV swerved hard left. Lena's head connected with the door, stars detonating behind her eyes. And then they were out, roaring onto a crosstown street, weaving through the sparse late-night traffic, the restaurant falling away behind them. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The only sounds were the engine, the wind through the shattered rear window, and Lena's own ragged breathing. Status, Damon said. The driver's voice was clipped and controlled. Reed is still inside covering our exit. We've got a tail. 2 vehicles, maybe 3. He swore low and precise. Glanced at Lena. Are you hit? She checked herself. Her hands were shaking violently. Her right cheek stung where a fragment of glass had cut it. Her shoulder ached from where she'd hit the door, but no blood beyond the cheek cut. No, I don't think so. He pulled back, checked her over with quick clinical movements. Wrist, neck, torso, then turned back to the front. Options. I can lose one in traffic. Can't guarantee the others without going off-road. The driver checked her mirror. They're hanging back, don't want to engage in the open. Keep it that way. Lena pressed herself against the seat and tried to find something to hold on to physically, mentally, any fixed point in a world that had become entirely fluid and terrifying. Her phone was still in her apron pocket. Her tips from the night were tucked in the zippered inner pouch. $43 plus the $200 from Damon, and somewhere outside a restaurant she would never work in again. People with guns were following the car she was in. Where are we going, Chio? She managed. Safe house. Damon was typing on his phone, his thumb moving with fast, economical precision. Upstate. Off the grid. What about the police? Shouldn't we? The police are 30 seconds behind the people trying to kill us. His tone was flat, factual. Right now we're on our own. The SUV cut sharply down a side street, then another, threading through lower Manhattan, with the driver's hand steady on the wheel. In the rear view, Lena caught a glimpse of one of the pursuing sedans attempting to follow, and then a sanitation truck pulled out from a loading bay, filling the street entirely. The driver allowed herself a small, tight smile. That's one. The others, Damon asked, still behind us. 3 blocks. They're smart staying spread out so I can't block them all at once. Then we changed the game. He tapped a name on his phone and raised it to his ear. Jonas, I need the alternate route to the 37th, full sweep protocol, and pull the GPS on the restaurant. I want to know exactly when and where those vehicles entered the perimeter. Lena watched him work, calm, methodical thinking, 3 moves ahead, even now, even in a car with a shattered rear window, while professional killers followed them through Manhattan. This was who he was beneath the magazine covers and the engagement toasts. Not the warm, boyish man who smiled at his fiancée. Someone harder, someone who had been building for a decade against the possibility of exactly this. Who are you? The question slipped out before she could catch it. He glanced at her sideways. Something flickered behind the slate eyes. Someone who should have seen this coming. Serena is either a very good actress or both. His voice carried the particular flatness of a wound that hadn't decided yet whether to bleed. Probably both. Silence for a moment. Why? Lena asked. Why would she? Money. The word landed like a stone. My company is sitting on $18 billion in liquid assets. Whoever planned this wants access to the transfer codes with those they can drain multiple accounts before anyone realizes what's happening. A pause. But it's not just Serena. The man she was speaking to outside that door, she called him by an operational phrase. Not a name. Which means she was trained to communicate that way. This wasn't improvised. The man. She said your people like he had an organization. He does. Damon pulled up a photograph on his phone and turned the screen toward her. Graham Slater, CEO of Slater Capital. We've been rivals for 12 years. He's tried to buy me out, undercut my acquisitions, poach my senior staff, every dirty play in the book. He paused. But this is different. This is desperation. Why now? Because 48 hours from now, I close a merger with Kellerman Industries. Once it finalizes, Slater Capital loses its largest client and roughly $3 billion in projected annual revenue. He's not losing a deal. He's losing his relevance. The blade-thin smile touched his face again. So apparently he decided to take mine instead. The weight of it settled over the SUV like cold fog. The engagement, the ring, the 18 months of careful proximity of learning his security protocols and personal rhythms of becoming indispensable and trusted and loved. How long? Lena asked quietly. He understood the question. 18 months. Met her at a charity gala. A beat. She was running a literacy foundation. Smart, passionate. She asked all the right questions. He exhaled slowly. Turns out the questions were data collection. Lena watched his profile in the dim light from the passing street lamps. I'm sorry. Don't be. I'm the one who ignored the signs. But the tightness around his jaw told a different story. You were in love. That's not a character flaw. It's a liability. Maybe. She looked out the window at the city streaming past. Or maybe she's just a very good liar, and that's on her. Not on you for trusting someone who worked that hard to earn it. He said nothing for a long moment. Then quietly, why did you trust me at the restaurant? You could have walked away, should have walked away. Lena considered the question honestly. Because you looked at me, she said finally. Really looked. Most people in that room didn't see me at all. I was furniture to them. But when I refilled your glass, you looked up. And when I gave you that note, you believed it. She paused. That mattered. The SUV crossed onto the West Side Highway, and the river appeared to their left, dark and wide and indifferent. The pursuing vehicles were gone now, lost in the grid somewhere behind them, unable to track without GPS that didn't exist. Well, Damon said at last. Let's hope I can return the favor. The safe house was 2 hours north of the city, buried at the end of a private access road that didn't appear on commercial maps and was identifiable from the county road only by a rusted mailbox number that corresponded to nothing publicly registered. It looked like a cabin rough cedar siding a stone chimney surrounded by second-growth forest that had slowly been reclaiming the land for 40 years. It was not a cabin. Inside, the walls were reinforced steel behind the cedar paneling. The windows were laminated ballistic glass. A surveillance array covered every approach from 300 meters in any direction, and the generator buried 20 meters behind the structure was powerful enough to run the building's systems for 72 hours without grid power. Lena didn't know any of this when she stumbled through the front door. She only knew that it was warm and quiet, and for the first time in 4 hours, nobody appeared to be actively trying to kill her. She sat on a leather couch that probably cost more than her yearly salary and put her face in her hands and tried to remember how to breathe. The driver, who introduced herself as Kara Voss, former Marine current head of Damon's tactical security team, swept the interior with the efficient thoroughness of someone who slept better after personally checking every room. Then she appeared with a glass of water and pressed it into Lena's hands. "Drink," she said. Lena drank. It helped slightly. "You did good tonight," Kara said. Her voice was surprisingly steady, stripped of the tactical sharpness she'd used during the extraction. "Most people freeze, you didn't." "I didn't do anything, I heard them talking and You made a choice." Kara's tone was firm. "Under pressure with everything to lose and nothing to gain. That's the whole ball game. That's it." From the back room, Damon's voice carried low urgent, the cadence of someone issuing instructions to multiple people simultaneously. Reed, probably, and his legal team. The counterattack was already beginning. Lena closed her eyes and let the silence of the forest press against the windows. She thought about her apartment, the stack of unopened mail on the kitchen counter, the third notice from the electric company, the plant on the windowsill that was slowly dying despite her best efforts. She thought about the last conversation she'd had with her father's old colleague, Dr. Brennan, who had asked how she was doing, and she had said, "Fine, fine. Everything is fine," because that was easier than the truth. She had been sleepwalking, moving through days like someone waiting for permission to have a future. Whatever this was, whatever was happening in the next room, in the next hours in the city she'd fled, it was the opposite of sleepwalking. The door to the back room opened and Damon emerged. He'd changed into dark jeans and a black sweater, his hair slightly disheveled, a tiredness in his face that the controlled anger couldn't fully suppress. He sat in the chair across from her and leaned forward, elbows on knees. "I need you to tell me everything," he said. "From the beginning. Every word you heard." She told him. She walked him through it in sequence, the voice outside the VIP room door, the transfer codes, the 11:15 timing, the phrase that still clanged around inside her skull like a struck bell, no witnesses. Serena's voice, soft and precise and entirely devoid of the warmth she'd performed at the engagement table. Damon listened without interrupting. His expression was carved stone throughout. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You mentioned something else," he said. "A phrase. Toward the end. Something about a specific location." Lena frowned, reaching. "She said something about the foundry. She told the man to make sure the foundry was ready." Damon went very still. The stillness of a man who has just heard a small detail click into a much larger, much more dangerous picture. "There's an abandoned industrial plant in Red Hook," he said slowly. "An old foundry. Slater bought it 6 months ago through a shell company. One of my analysts flagged the acquisition as suspicious, a building with no apparent commercial use purchased by an entity that traced back through 4 layers of incorporation before hitting a dead end." He paused. "I dismissed it. I shouldn't have." "Why would he need an abandoned foundry?" "Because it's off the grid. No commercial surveillance. No registered occupants. No reason for anyone to look twice at the power draw from a building that's supposed to be derelict." His jaw tightened. "The perfect place to run a black site server farm. Route the stolen transfers through enough offshore shells and bounce them off enough proxies, and by the time anyone traces the origin, the money's been moved 17 times. Lena's mind raced. "So the transfer codes, he's not just taking your money." "No. He stood pacing with the controlled energy of a man who needed to be moving. Based on what you overheard, 12 accounts, the routing you saw on the server he's using tonight to drain funds from every major enemy he has. Multiple targets, simultaneous transfers, all disguised as connected to a single cyber attack event that will be blamed on a foreign actor. He stopped, which means whoever is running those servers at the foundry is doing it right now. Lena stood up. Her legs were unsteady, but her voice wasn't. I grew up in Red Hook, she said. He turned. My father worked construction in that neighborhood for 20 years. I know those streets, the alleys, the canal access tunnels, under the old warehouse district. She met his eyes. If you need to get into that building without being seen, I can show you how. The silence stretched between them. You don't have to do this, he said. You've already done more than... They said no witnesses. Her voice came out hard and clear. That means they're coming for me regardless. So yes, I do have to do this. He studied her for a long moment. Then slowly, that dangerous smile, the one that looked nothing like the one in the magazine covers, touched the corners of his mouth. All right, he said. Then let's go to war. Outside the safe house windows, the forest was dark and deep and utterly still, and somewhere to the south, the city burned with light that had no idea what was coming. The war room was a converted garage behind the safe house, the kind of space that had been built for one purpose and retrofitted for another. Its ceiling still hung with old wooden beams and the faint ghost of motor oil in the air. But along the walls, banks of monitors displayed live security feeds cascading financial data and satellite imagery sharp enough to read license plates. Extension cables ran in organized clusters across the concrete floor. Whiteboards were covered in diagrams that would mean nothing to a civilian but read like tactical blueprints to anyone who knew the language. Damon stood at the center of it. Kara flanked him on the left. Two other members of the security team who had arrived within the hour occupied the right. Jonas, a wiry tech specialist in his late 20s with nervous hands and the most alert eyes Lena had ever seen on a person who looked otherwise unremarkable. And Marcus, a former NYPD detective built like a concrete piling, whose face wore the particular expression of a man who had stopped being surprised by the human capacity for calculated evil somewhere around his third year on the job. Reed Knox was still in Manhattan coordinating with local authorities running interference through channels that Lena didn't fully understand and wouldn't have believed existed before tonight. Lena stood near the door, arms wrapped around herself, watching these people move with the practiced efficiency of a team that had run through variations of this scenario before. She felt like a child who had wandered into an operating room present, alive, and profoundly out of place. Listen up. Damon's voice cut through the low hum of keyboards and equipment fans. Everyone stopped, turned focused. Two objectives. 1. Stop the transfer before it completes. 2. Obtain evidence that proves Slater and Serena orchestrated this evidence that holds up in court, not just in the media. We need both. Jonas tapped rapidly at his laptop without looking up. I've been monitoring your authentication servers, sir. Nothing has moved yet, but there's sustained probing activity from offshore IP's multiple attempts to bypass the two-factor protocols. They're methodical, patient. How long until they break through? Your security architecture is exceptional, genuinely. Jonas finally looked up. But if they have your physical phone and Serena knows your biometric patterns and behavioral sequences 3 hours, maybe less. Damon's expression didn't change, but a muscle in his jaw tightened. His phone, taken during the chaos at the restaurant, most likely lifted with the precision of someone who had planned the moment, who had known exactly when his attention would be elsewhere. During the engagement toast. During her performance. Then we move now. He turned to the satellite image of Red Hook, displayed on the largest monitor, a sprawling complex of brick buildings and rusted industrial frameworks surrounded by chain-link fencing and overgrown lots, the kind of structure that accumulated in waterfront neighborhoods like sediment, the remnants of industries that had moved on and left their bones behind. Lena, walk me through the approach. She stepped forward. Her pulse was hammering, but her voice was steady. That's the eastern edge. She pointed to a shadow on the satellite image, a darker band running parallel to the main structure. There's an old canal access maintenance tunnels that were dug in the 1940s for the industrial operations. My father's crew used those passages when they were working on the waterfront renovation in 2015. Most people in the city don't know they exist. She traced the line with her finger. They run under the foundry's east wing and connect to the basement loading dock level. The entrance is through a grate in an alley between two derelict buildings' chain-link fence rusted easy to cut. Kara leaned forward, studying the image. How wide are those tunnels? Wide enough for two people walking side by side. Maybe three if you don't mind your shoulders touching the walls. And current security state. The tunnels themselves, none that I know of. If Slater's team is security conscious, they'll have eyes on the main approaches. Surface level perimeter, maybe rooftop coverage, but a maintenance tunnel that isn't on any public schematic. She shook her head. It's a blind spot. Or they've wired the whole substructure with sensors and we walk into a kill box, Marcus said. His voice was flat, not pessimistic, simply accounting for variables the way a man who had worked crime scenes learned to do. Only one way to find out, Damon said. Kara straightened, crossing her arms. Sir, with respect, we don't have schematics of the interior. We don't have backup beyond this room. We have an unknown number of armed hostiles on home turf and a 2-hour clock. She paused. The professional play is to coordinate with NYPD, get a tactical unit, do this properly. Which takes time we don't have. Damon held her gaze. And the moment we bring in law enforcement officially, the moment a badge appears anywhere near that building, Slater's lawyers file emergency injunctions, his people wipe the servers, and the evidence disappears before we get within 3 blocks. He shook his head. We do this quietly. We do this now. Kara held his gaze for a long, deliberate moment. Then she nodded once. Your funeral, boss. Let's hope not. He turned back to the room. Jonas, you stay here. Monitor the authentication attempts continuously. The second you see any transfer activity start, you call me immediately. And see if you can locate my phone physically if it's inside the foundry. I want to know what floor. Copy. Marcus, you and Kara are perimeter security and overwatch. If our approach goes sideways, I need extraction options ready. He paused. I need you both ready to pull people out, not just cover retreat. Marcus nodded. Slow. Certain. Understood. Damon looked at Lena. His gaze was direct, undecorated. You're with me. You get us in, then you stay back. Understood. No. A beat of silence. Kara's expression remained carefully neutral. Jonas looked up from his keyboard. This isn't a negotiation, Damon said quietly. You're right. It isn't. Lena stepped toward him. I didn't come this far to hide in a tunnel while you walk into a building full of people who want you dead. And for the record, I'm not here because you need me to be brave. I'm here because I'm already a target. She held his gaze. So don't waste time trying to protect me from a situation I'm already inside. The room was quiet. Then Kara's lips twitched just barely. Just for a second, the ghost of a smile that she extinguished immediately. Damon studied Lena for a moment longer. Then he nodded. Fine, but you follow my lead, and if I tell you to run, you run. No argument, no hesitation. Deal. Good. He checked his watch. We leave in 20 minutes. Gear up. The drive to Red Hook took 90 minutes. The city gradually shed its midtown intensity as they moved south and east, the glass towers giving way to the older, lower architecture of Brooklyn's industrial waterfront neighborhoods that had been dying and reviving and dying again for decades, block by block, story by story. Kara had fitted Lena with a tactical vest, lightweight Kevlar cut for movement with a low profile that wouldn't show under the jacket they'd found in a storage locker that was 3 sizes too large for her, but better than nothing. She had also pressed a small canister into her hand. Military-grade pepper spray, Kara said. You point the nozzle, you press the trigger, and then you run. You don't look back. You run. What if you run? Kara's expression left no interpretive space. There's no scenario in that building where you staying to fight is the right play. You're my early warning system and you're Damon's route in. Beyond that, your job is to survive. Are we clear? Clear. Good. A pause, and then something shifted in Kara's face just briefly, just a degree. You're braver than you think. I want you to know that. But bravery without discipline gets you killed, and I'd prefer not to explain to anyone why a waitress from Manhattan died in a Red Hook tunnel. Lena almost laughed. I'm technically unemployed now. Former waitress, then. Kara turned back to her equipment. The principal stands. In the sedan Daman drove, Lena sat in the passenger seat and watched the city change outside the window. She recognized this neighborhood not from recent memory, but from the deep sensory memory of childhood. The corner bodega where her father used to buy the Vietnamese coffee, he'd developed a taste for during a construction job in Sunset Park. The park where she'd learned to ride a bike on a rusted secondhand bicycle that wobbled enthusiastically. The block where she'd kissed her first boyfriend in the amber light of a summer evening, half a lifetime ago, when the future still felt like an invitation rather than a warning. You grew up here, Damon said. He'd been watching her. Not this block, but close. My dad worked construction all through this part of Brooklyn for 20 years. I spent a lot of summers on job sites. She paused. He said the city was always being built and unbuilt and rebuilt, that the only constant was the work. What happened to him? Cancer. The word came out clean and flat the way it did when you'd said it enough times that the surface hardened. 3 years ago, that's when I left law school. She looked at the dark street ahead. He would have hated that I quit. He would have hated it even more if he knew I was doing it because of him. Damon was quiet for a moment. My father died when I was 19. Heart attack. He was a high school math teacher who read every business book he could find and thought I was going to change the world. He glanced at her sideways. I've spent 15 years trying to prove him right. Sometimes I forget that was supposed to be a tribute, not a pressure system. The silence between them was companionable rather than empty. The silence of two people who had arrived at the same emotional geography by very different routes. There, Lena said. That alley. Damon pulled over and cut the engine. The van with Marcus and Kara parked a block back, maintaining overwatch distance. The alley ran between two derelict brick buildings. Former warehouse loading bays, their roll-up doors sealed with corrugated steel and padlocks that had been there long enough to rust into permanence. The fence at the alley's end was exactly as she'd remembered, chain link sagging, eaten at by years of salt air and neglect. They climbed out into the cold. Lena's breath fogged immediately. The neighborhood smelled of brine and old concrete, and the particular emptiness of industrial spaces at night, a smell that Lena associated in some tangled emotional synapse with her father's work boots, and the lunches she used to bring him on job sites when she was small enough to think construction workers were a kind of magic. Damon produced bolt cutters from his bag and made quick work of the padlock. The gate swung open with a metallic groan that sounded outrageously loud in the stillness. Beyond it, a set of concrete stairs descended into darkness. Lena activated her phone light and started down. The tunnel smelled like deep earth and rust, like water that had been standing in the same place for decades, like time stored in concrete. The walls were close, rough poured, studded with old conduit brackets, where electrical runs had been stripped out years ago. Water dripped somewhere ahead of them, rhythmic and patient. Their footsteps echoed. They moved in single file, Lena ahead. She kept one hand on the wall, feeling the texture of it change, smoother where the concrete had been poured in different phases, rougher where seepage had left mineral deposits over the years. Behind her, Damon's light swept the passage in steady arcs. His phone buzzed. He checked it. Jonas, he murmured. He has a lock on my phone's GPS. It's inside the foundry. A pause. Second floor, east wing. That's the old office level, Lena whispered back. Climate-controlled spaces, isolated from the factory floor. If they're running a serious server operation, that's exactly where they'd set up. Then that's where we go. 200 yards. The tunnel ended at a rusted metal grate, a circular frame maybe 4 feet in diameter, the kind designed for equipment access rather than human passage. The bottom corner had corroded away over decades of moisture exposure, leaving a gap nearly 2 feet wide. Just enough. Damon went first, sliding through with a controlled agility that suggested he was more physically capable than his corporate biography implied. Lena followed her vest, catching briefly on a jagged edge before she twisted free and emerged into the space beyond. The old loading dock was cavernous and stripped bare. Industrial hooks hung empty from overhead cranes. Pallets were stacked in the corner, their wood gray and crumbling. Moonlight came through 3 broken skylights 50 feet above, casting the space in silver and shadow. And at the far end of the dock, beyond a set of corroded loading doors, the factory floor stretched out like the skeleton of some massive industrial organism, frozen at the moment of its death. And in the distance, on the second floor, electric light. White, harsh, institutional, the unmistakable color of serious equipment running at full operation. Damon's earpiece crackled, Kara's voice barely above a whisper. "We've got eyes on the perimeter from the overwatch position. 2 guards at the main entrance rotating every 8 minutes. 1 more on the roof southeast corner stationary. No visible coverage on the east side." "Copy. We're inside. Moving to the east wing staircase." They crossed the loading dock in silence, keeping to the wall, avoiding the patches of moonlight that would render them visible to anyone looking down from above. The factory floor beyond was a maze conveyor systems frozen mid-operation industrial machinery, standing like monuments to a labor that no longer existed. Catwalks overhead creating a second-level grid of shadows and lines. They moved through it like water through obstacles, patient low choosing each step before committing to it. The light ahead grew brighter as they crossed the floor, the sound of equipment fans becoming audible beneath the silence. The staircase was metal bolted to the east wall, its treads worn smooth by decades of foot traffic. Damon tested the first step. It groaned low and resonant and paused. No response from above. He started climbing. Lena followed, stepping where he stepped, matching his rhythm. At the top, a narrow hallway. Office doors, most hanging open, some missing entirely. Debris on the floors. The particular desolation of commercial spaces abandoned mid-use as though everyone left in a hurry and never came back. At the far end of the hallway, 1 door was closed. Beneath it, a line of bright light. They approached in silence. Damon stopped at the door, listened. The sound from within was subtle, the white noise of servers, the click of a keyboard, the almost imperceptible hum of cooling systems under load. Lena could feel the slight warmth emanating from the gap at the floor. Damon's hand went to his weapon. He tried the handle. It turned. He eased the door open. The room was a collision of eras. Old metal filing cabinets shoved against the walls, a broken desk overturned in the corner, plaster crumbling from the ceiling in patches, and in the center of all of it, an operation that belonged to a different decade entirely. Server racks, 8 of them, gleaming black, their front panels alive with blinking status lights. Screens displaying cascading code authentication protocols, transfer sequences. Cables organized with precision that seemed almost artistic against the background of industrial decay. And at the main terminal, a man. Mid-30s. Thin. The particular pallor of someone who spent most of their waking hours in artificially lit rooms. He wore a dark technical jacket and noise-canceling headphones, and his fingers moved across the keyboard with the focused speed of someone deep in a process that was going exactly as planned. He didn't hear them enter. Damon crossed the room in 3 strides. The gun pressed against the back of the man's neck with a soft, precise sound. "Don't move." His voice was utterly calm. "Don't speak. Hands where I can see them." The man froze. His hands came up slowly, palms flat, fingers spread, the universal language of someone who had decided very quickly that the odds were not in their favor. "Lena," Damon said. "The screens." She moved to the terminal. The data was dense, layered, scrolling at a pace that made her eyes water. Account codes, routing numbers, transfer protocols, offshore shell designations. And in the corner of the screen, occupying a status bar that hummed with quiet urgency. "Transfer in progress. 47% complete." Her stomach dropped. "It's happening now," she said. "The transfer. It's almost halfway done." Damon hauled the man upright by his collar, turning him to face him. The man's face was gray with fear, his eyes moving rapidly between Damon's face and the gun, performing calculations that were clearly not landing in his favor. "Who are you?" Damon asked. I'm a contractor. I was hired through an intermediary. I process transfers. I don't ask questions I don't know anything about." "You know exactly what this is." Damon's voice didn't rise, didn't harden. It simply became more precise, like a blade getting narrower. "Where's Slater? Where's Serena?" The man hesitated. Damon pressed the gun harder. Last chance. The resolve crumbled. Third floor. They're upstairs. Please, I'm just doing a job. I have a family. Shut up. Damon glanced at Lena without moving the gun. Can you stop the transfer? Lena was already looking at the code. 2 years of pre-law undergraduate work in computer science. It felt like archaeology, like excavating skills from a person she had been before her life broke apart. But the fundamentals were still there. Architecture, process, threading, authentication logic. It was sloppy work built fast, prioritizing speed over elegance. She could see the skeleton beneath it. Maybe, she said, if I can isolate the transfer process thread and execute a hard kill command. She pulled up a command prompt, her fingers moving. But if I get the syntax wrong, I might trigger a lockout protocol, or alert whoever's monitoring remotely. Do it anyway. She started working. The code opened up beneath her fingers like a familiar text. Not easy, not without effort, but readable. She found the transfer process, isolated it, began tracing the routing logic back to its authentication source. What she found stopped her. Damon, her voice was very quiet. This isn't just your accounts. He turned slightly toward her, keeping the gun on the contractor. There are 12 sets of credentials here, 12 separate account structures routing through 4 different offshore shells. He's not just targeting you. She looked up. He's draining everyone, every rival he has, every competitor, every legal obstacle, every person who stood in his way. He's using tonight to settle every score at once. Slater's version of a scorched earth, Damon said. His jaw was a rigid line. While I'm dead and the investigation focuses on a murder, he has 48 hours to disappear the transfers before anyone starts looking in the right direction. The door exploded inward. Lena dove sideways on pure reflex, her shoulder hitting the edge of the desk, pain detonating in a white flash as gunfire tore through the room in short, controlled bursts. The contractor went down. She didn't watch. She scrambled back toward the terminal, her hands moving on autopilot fingers, finding the command line she'd been building. Damon returned fire from behind one of the server racks. Precise, economical, each shot placed with a calm that was either training or a kind of terrifying discipline under pressure. One of the attackers stumbled back into the hallway. But there were more. She could hear them in the corridor, coordinated, systematic, the sound of a team that had been waiting for exactly this moment. Lena the transfer. She was already there. The kill command was 3 layers deep, buried under encryption architecture that had been designed to resist exactly this kind of intervention. She had cracked the first layer when the attack started. The second yielded beneath her fingers with a logic puzzle's particular satisfaction. The third, a bullet punched through the monitor 6 inches from her left hand. Glass erupted. A shard opened a line along her cheek, just below where the earlier cut had already dried. She felt the warmth of blood and didn't stop. Couldn't stop. One more line. She hit enter. The screens went black. A half-second of silence in which nothing existed except her own breathing and the ghost of the command she'd just executed. Then Damon's voice, sharp and urgent, "Move! Now!" He grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the back of the room. A second door, she hadn't seen it, hidden behind an overturned filing cabinet that had been pulled aside to allow access. It led into a secondary corridor, narrower, darker, smelling of old insulation. They ran. Behind them, footsteps pounded through the server room. Voices shouted in rapid, clipped exchanges. Gunfire chewed through plaster and old lathe as someone in the hallway fired blind, anticipating their trajectory. Kara's voice crackled in Damon's earpiece. "What the hell is happening up there?" "We're blown. Need extraction. West side. Now. On our way. 2 minutes." 2 minutes. They hit a stairwell door and Damon kicked it open. The stairs went up. He went up. Lena followed without questioning if he was going toward Slater and Serena, toward the people who had started all of this. She understood why, even as the rational part of her brain screamed at her to find the nearest exit. 3rd floor. Damon kicked open the landing door. The hallway was lined with windows overlooking the factory floor 40 feet below, and at the far end where the hallway opened into a large corner office, light spilled from an open doorway. They moved toward it. Damon's weapon was raised, his body angled to present the smallest possible profile. Lena stayed close, one hand on the wall, her own heartbeat the loudest thing in the world. They reached the doorway. Damon stopped, went completely rigid. Lena looked past him. The office was pristine. Not the decayed industrial aesthetic of everything else in the building, this room had been deliberately restored. Mahogany desk, leather chairs, a Persian rug on the cleared floor, a crystal decanter of whiskey on a side table still half full, and standing behind the desk, one hand resting on its polished surface, a glass in the other, wearing an expression of calm, amused satisfaction that looked as though it had been prepared for this exact moment. Graham Slater. He was exactly as his photograph suggested. Handsome in the predatory way of men who had learned to weaponize their appearance. Dark hair shot through with distinguished silver at the temples, wearing a suit that had probably cost $30,000 and currently looked as though he'd dressed for a board presentation rather than a criminal operation. He smiled when he saw them. "Damon," he said. The warmth in his voice was almost convincing. "I was starting to wonder if you'd make it." And beside him, her face a mask of cold sculptural beauty, wearing the same champagne gown that had shimmered at the engagement party, but now looking like armor or a costume for a role she had rehearsed so long she had almost forgotten it was a role Serena Vale. She looked at Damon with an expression that was impossible to read clearly. Grief or calculation, or the precise space between them where one could masquerade as the other. "Hello, darling," she said softly. "I'm afraid the engagement is off." Damon's gun hand didn't waver, but Lena saw his knuckles go white around the grip. The silence in the room was the kind that contained everything. Every lie, every performance, every careful fabrication that had been constructed and maintained over 18 months of intimacy. It pressed against the walls. It had weight. "That's far enough, Cross." Graham Slater set his glass down with the unhurried precision of a man who had never been rushed by anything in his life. He gestured toward the windows behind him where the factory floor fell away 40 feet below. "You're a smart man. You know how this ends." "Tell me," Damon said, "if you pull that trigger, you're a murderer. In a building full of my people, none of whom witnessed anything that would exonerate you." Slater clasped his hands behind his back. "If you somehow manage to shoot your way out, you spend the rest of your life under investigation, your reputation destroyed, your merger in ruins." He tilted his head. "The transfer failed inconvenient, yes, but that was always a secondary play, a distraction." Damon's expression didn't shift. "What's the primary play?" Slater smiled. It was the smile of a man who had been waiting very patiently to say the next words. "You." Serena spoke. Her voice was soft, almost sorrowful, and terrifyingly composed. "Think about what happens in the morning, Damon. A prominent tech CEO involved in a violent incident at a Manhattan restaurant, fleeing the scene, making paranoid accusations against his innocent, grief-stricken fiancée, breaking into a private property in Brooklyn." She paused. "The Kellerman board will invoke the morality clause. They'll walk away. And when they do, I'll be there," Slater said pleasantly. "With a counteroffer. Kellerman Industries becomes mine. Your largest acquisition, the one that was supposed to cement your legacy, becomes the instrument of your destruction." He spread his hands in a gesture of elegant inevitability. "And you become a cautionary tale about what happens when a brilliant man loses his grip on reality." The elegance of it was nauseating. They hadn't needed to kill him. They'd never needed to kill him. The murder had been a backup plan, a contingency. The real weapon was the narrative, the story that would run on every financial news channel by morning, while Damon Cross was either dead or discredited, either way irrelevant. "You won't get away with this," Damon said. "I have evidence, witnesses." "The contractor downstairs is dead," Slater said pleasantly. "Killed during your violent rampage through this building. Very tragic." He glanced at Lena with a cold appraisal that made her feel like an entry in a ledger. "And the traumatized waitress with a history of financial instability and a dropped-out law degree. Darling, no one will believe her." Serena took a step forward, and for the first time tonight, Lena saw something genuine move across her face. Not the performed warmth of the engagement party, not the cold operational mask, but something in between, something raw and uncomfortable. The face of a person who had convinced themselves that the terrible thing they were doing was somehow also logical. I'm sorry, Daman, she said quietly. Truly, you're a good man, better than you need to be. But you are also the key to everything Graham and I have been building. You were going to marry me, Damon said. His voice was very quiet. You wore my ring. And I meant it. Her eyes glistened. One tear traced down her cheek with perfect timing. In the moment, I meant it. That's what makes this effective. When I tell the world how you changed, how you became paranoid, unstable, how I tried to reach you but you pushed me away, they'll believe me, Damon. Because love makes the best lies true. Lena's hands clenched into fists at her sides, and then she heard herself speak. You made a mistake. Every eye in the room turned to her. Slater's expression shifted to the particular amusement of a man who finds unexpected entertainment in the behavior of the irrelevant. Do enlighten us, Miss Hart. Lena held his gaze. Her voice was steadier than she had any right to expect. You assumed we came alone. She let the words sit for a moment. You assumed we were desperate enough to walk into your building without insurance, without backup, without documentation. She tilted her head. Damon Cross didn't build a $12 billion company by walking into rooms without preparation. Damon picked up the thread immediately. My security team has been recording everything since we entered this building, he said. His voice was absolutely controlled. Video, audio, GPS, coordinates time-stamped and streamed to a secure off-site server with instructions to release everything to federal authorities and major media outlets if we don't check in every 15 minutes. He glanced at his watch. We're about 3 minutes from that deadline. Slater's smile faltered, just slightly. Just enough. His eyes moved to Serena. She looked at Damon, at Lena, then back at Damon, and Lena saw it the moment Serena Vale calculated the bluff. He's lying, Graham. Her voice was flat with certainty. If he had that leverage, he would have led with it. He wouldn't have come through the tunnels with a waitress and a gun. He'd have sent lawyers and federal agents. She took a step towards Slater. He's improvising. Slater's smile returned, harder now, stripped of the performative warmth. She's right. He picked up his phone from the desk. Here's what's actually going to happen. I make a call. My people come up here and we have a very unfortunate accident. He began to dial. 2 bodies in a condemned building. Structural failure, perhaps. Such a waste. The window exploded. Glass and wood frame detonated inward as something heavy came crashing through, and in the half-second before Lena's body processed the input and threw her to the floor, she registered 3 things simultaneously. The sound was wrong for a single object. It was the sound of multiple simultaneous impacts from outside. Kara's voice in Damon's earpiece cutting through the chaos like a wire pulled taut. Engaging, move, west stairwell, 30 seconds. And Damon's hand closing around her arm, hauling her upright and toward the door before the last shard of glass had finished falling. They ran into the hallway and the night swallowed them whole. The corridor hit them like a wall of sound-distant gunfire from outside the building. The closer percussion of boots on the stairs below the particular acoustic chaos of a structure whose emptiness amplified every violent noise to cathedral proportions. Damon moved through it like a man who had mapped the route in his head 3 times before committing to it. Left at the landing. Down the west stairwell, Kara had specified it, the route was locked in. Behind them, Slater was shouting something into his phone, his voice losing its practiced smoothness for the first time, the operational mask slipping just enough to reveal the fear beneath. Slater was afraid, not of dying, of losing. Those were different things, Lena understood now, and understanding that difference told her something important about who Graham Slater actually was beneath the cultured performance. Men who were afraid of dying made desperate, sloppy decisions. Men who were afraid of losing made calculated, relentless ones. She ran harder. The stairwell door banged open beneath Damon's shoulder. They plunged down, taking stairs 2 at a time, the metal treads ringing like bells. Second-floor landing, they blew past it. The server room was up there, somewhere dark now, the equipment still running its cooling fans in the absence of any transfer to execute patient machines that had been designed to outlast the humans who operated them. First floor. The stairwell opened into a service corridor that ran parallel to the main factory floor, a narrow artery designed for workers moving equipment, and not for this. Not for two people running from armed men through the dark. Kara's voice crackled. West side, moving to your position. 3 hostiles between you and the factory floor exit. Copy. Damon didn't slow. Alternative? Loading dock access. East side of the corridor. Secondary exit onto the service road. Marcus is already there. They ran east. The corridor narrowed, then widened past a bank of old electrical panels. Somewhere behind them, the sound of pursuit had gone quiet. Too quiet. Damon stopped, pressed them both against the wall, held up a hand. Nothing. The footsteps had stopped, which meant they had spread out, cut off the angles, were waiting for them to walk into a pre-positioned crossfire. They repositioned, Damon said, voice barely audible. His eyes moved in the darkness. There's a storage room 15 feet ahead on the left. Old equipment bay. External wall. You're sure? No. He moved. She followed. The door was unlocked. The lock had corroded into uselessness sometime in the past decade. The room beyond was dense with old industrial equipment. Motor housings, cable drums, disassembled, conveyor components stacked in configurations that created a maze of metal and shadow. At the far end, a row of industrial windows, most sealed, but one in the lower corner had a panel that had been knocked out by weather or time, leaving a gap roughly 2 feet square. Not elegant, real. Damon crossed the room and reached the window. Turned back to Lena. You first. You're larger. Exactly. Go. She went. The gap scraped her shoulders and caught on the vest, and she pushed through with an ungraceful twist that landed her on her hands and knees on cold ground outside. The service road ran directly behind this section of the foundry, cracked asphalt, unlit, running between the building's exterior and a rusted chain-link fence beyond which lay an empty lot full of brush and broken concrete. Damon came through behind her in a single fluid motion. Marcus was at the road's end. He materialized from the shadow of a parked work truck with the reliability of someone who understood that in moments like this, being exactly where you said you would be was the only thing that mattered. Car's 30 yards. Move. They moved. The night air was sharp with cold and the smell of the waterfront. Lena ran on burning legs and did not think about the pain in her shoulder or the blood on her cheek or the fact that 20 minutes ago she had been in a room with a man who had calmly described murdering her as a logistical detail. She thought about the transfer sequence going dark on that screen. She had stopped it. Whatever happened next, whatever Slater's primary play was, whatever he still believed he held in reserve, she had stopped that. The car was a dark sedan, different from the SUV they'd arrived in. Marcus drove without speaking, his eyes moving between the road and mirrors with the practiced rhythm of a man who spent years making sure nothing was behind him. Kara, Damon said. Still inside? Her voice came back slightly strained. Moving toward tunnel exit, 2 minutes. Status on you. A pause. Fine. Meet me at secondary extraction. 8 minutes. Damon exhaled. He turned to look at Lena in the back seat. Her face in the passing streetlights was a catalog of the night's events, the cut on her cheek bruising along her jaw, the particular exhaustion of someone running on the final reserves of adrenaline before the body presents its bill. The transfer, he said. You stopped it. Yes. How much did you see before the attack? Enough. She closed her eyes, briefly reconstructing. 12 account structures. 4 offshore shell tiers came in routing through a Netherlands holding entity into 2 Singapore accounts. The authentication source was physical, not remote. Whoever initiated the sequence had to be present in that building. She opened her eyes. Jonas can reconstruct the full architecture from the process logs if they weren't wiped. There's always a trace. He was quiet for a moment. You dropped out of law school, he said, because of your father. Yes. And you just cracked a 3-layer encrypted kill command under active fire. I had motivation. He turned back to the front window. The car moved through the quiet Brooklyn streets, heading away from the foundry and toward the next phase of a war that Lena was beginning to understand would not end cleanly or without cost. But it would end. She was certain of that now in some bone-deep place that hadn't existed in her before tonight. Slater had made the critical mistake that all architects of elaborate deceptions eventually made. He had underestimated the person with nothing to lose. And Lena Hart, former law student, former daughter, former invisible waitress, was beginning to understand that nothing to lose was not the same as nothing to fight for. They drove. The city spread around them, indifferent and brilliant, alive with all its ordinary human activity. Delivery trucks and late-night pedestrians and lit windows where people who knew nothing of any of this were living their quiet, ordinary lives. All of it Lena thought worth protecting. The war was not over, but she was still in it, and that for now was enough. The secondary extraction point was a parking structure 3 blocks from the foundry, one of those anonymous multi-level hulks that city neighborhoods accumulated the way skin accumulates scar tissue, unremarked and utilitarian and utterly invisible until you needed them. Kara was there when they arrived. She was leaning against the concrete pillar at the structure's entrance with the studied casualness of a woman who had made a deliberate decision not to show how much something had cost her. Her tactical jacket was torn at the left shoulder. A cut ran along her cheekbone that was still seeping. She held herself with the upright tension of a person managing pain by refusing to acknowledge it. But she was there, on her feet, eyes moving. Damon crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and gripped her arm, checking. How bad? Superficial. She held his gaze until he accepted the answer and released her. Then she looked at Lena. Transfer set. Stopped, Lena said. 47% complete when I killed it. Something that might have been relief moved through Kara's expression before the operational mask reclaimed it. Good. That's something. She turned back to Damon. Slater's people are pulling back from the building, which means he's going to a secondary position and reassessing. He has one, Damon said. He wouldn't have built this operation without a fallback. He pulled out his phone. Reed, status. Reed's voice came back clipped and controlled. NYPD has the restaurant. 3 of Slater's people in custody, 7 more fled the scene. I've been coordinating with a contact at the federal level. They're interested, but they need something concrete before they can move officially. A pause. We need the evidence, sir. Without it, Slater's lawyers file a false arrest suit and walk him out in 48 hours. We have server data from the foundry, obtained by breaking and entering without a warrant. His defense team will have it suppressed before lunch. Reed's voice was flat with the particular frustration of a man who understood both sides of the legal system. We need something that originated through official channels, or something so public that suppression becomes politically impossible. Damon was quiet for a moment. Marcus stood nearby with his arms crossed, watching the street below the parking structure's open side, saying nothing. Serena, Damon said at last. The word fell into the group like a stone. She's the weak link, Lena said. Everyone looked at her. She pressed forward because the idea had been forming since the 3rd floor office, since the moment she had watched Serena's mask crack just briefly, just along the seam, where the human being that remained inside it pushed back against the architecture of what she had become. She's not Slater. She's not a sociopath running a long game without emotional investment. She's someone who convinced herself this was necessary. That distinction matters. She tried to have him killed, Kara said. I know. But in that office when Damon called her out, when Marcus... She stopped, chose the words carefully. When the situation became real rather than operational, something changed in her. She fractured, briefly, but it was real. Damon was watching her with an expression she couldn't fully read. What are you suggesting? He asked. Give her a choice. Lena met his eyes. Cooperation and immunity, or prison and disgrace. She's facing accomplice to murder charges. The contractor in that server room is dead. That's not corporate espionage anymore. That's a capital charge. And if she's intelligent, which she clearly is, she knows that Slater will cut her loose the moment she becomes a liability. She paused. We contact her, tonight, before Slater's lawyers build a wall around her. We give her one window to get through before it closes. Read through the earpiece. She'll never agree to a meeting, and even if she does, it's a trap. Everything is a trap, Damon said quietly. He was looking at something distant, some calculation running behind the slate eyes. But she won't be able to resist. She'll want to know what I'm thinking. She'll want to justify herself. He paused. That's human nature, and it's exploitable. He pulled out his phone and began typing. Checked. The command center they relocated to was not a safe house, but a floor in an anonymous office building in Midtown that belonged through 3 layers of corporate entities to a security consulting firm that Reed Knox had quietly established 7 years ago as a contingency resource for exactly these kinds of situations. It occupied the 15th floor and looked from the outside like nothing at all. Inside it looked like a war room. Multiple screens displaying surveillance feeds, financial data streams, and a live news ticker that was already running Damon's face under chyrons that made Lena's stomach tighten. Jonas was there when they arrived. His 3 keyboards occupied his face, lit blue-white by the screens in a way that made him look like he hadn't slept in a week, which Lena suspected was not far from the truth. "Tell me," Damon said. Jonas swiveled. "Good news and bad news. Good news, I pulled everything from the Foundry servers before the transfer crashed. Full data dump, account structures, routing, logic, communication threads, the shell company architecture." He tapped one screen. "There's a law firm in the Cayman Islands that acts as the registered agent for all 4 shell tiers. They have one significant client, Slater Capital. One major client, which is circumstantial in isolation, but combined with..." He opened a second window. The contractor wasn't just sloppy with his operational security, he was catastrophically sloppy. He kept records, emails, chat logs, payment confirmations, including messages from an address registered to a personal assistant in Serena Vale's household staff. Lena leaned forward. "That ties her directly." "It ties her assistant," Damon said. "Her lawyers will argue she was acting without authorization." "Not if we have her voice." Reed from across the room was pulling up something on a tablet. "I've been going through the restaurant's external security cameras, the system that runs the parking structure and the service entrance. Timestamp puts 2 of Slater's men arriving 2 hours before the event began. They entered through the kitchen, which means someone on the inside had access codes." He set the tablet on the table. "Someone who had been to the restaurant before. Multiple times." He looked at Damon. "Serena had dinner there 4 times in the 6 weeks before tonight. Private room bookings." "Reconnaissance," Kara said flatly. "Building a pattern. Learning the staff rotations, the security blind spots, the service corridor layout." Reed's expression was controlled. She wasn't just Slater's access to Damon. She was the operational architect on the ground. The room was quiet for a moment. Damon's phone buzzed on the table. He looked at it. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted with a quality Lena was beginning to recognize, the minute recalibration of a man absorbing new information and immediately integrating it into an existing strategic picture. "She agreed, yet," he said. 1 hour, the boathouse in Central Park." Kara put her hands flat on the table. "That's a kill zone." "Yes. Open sight lines, multiple approaches. If Slater has people watching her, he does, then this is an ambush, which is why you'll have overwatch positions around the perimeter, thermal imaging, a full extraction team ready to move the second anything shifts." He looked at Reed. "And you'll have a response element staged 2 blocks out." Reed nodded, slow, once. "Yes, sir." Damon turned to Lena. His gaze was direct and without deflection. "You should stay here. This part doesn't require, 'I'm coming.'" "Lena. She saw me at the restaurant. She knows I'm a witness. If I'm there, if she sees that I'm not hiding, that I'm not afraid of her, it changes the psychological dynamic." Lena held his gaze. "People confess to other people, not to lawyers, not to billionaires, to other people who've seen them at their worst and are still standing there." The silence stretched. Then Kara said without any particular inflection, "She's right." Damon looked at Kara, then back at Lena. A long moment in which she could see him working through every angle and arriving at the same conclusion she had. "All right," he said. "Let's prepare." Central Park at 3 in the morning was a different city. Not the park that belonged to joggers and families and weekend picnics, but the park that had always existed beneath that version, the one made of shadow and still water, and the particular silence that settles over a place when the humans who claim ownership of it have temporarily retreated. The boathouse sat at the lake's edge, its old wooden structure elegant and slightly melancholy, lit from below by the scattered reflection of distant street lamps on the water. Empty at this hour. Still. Serena was waiting on the deck. She wore a long dark coat over the champagne gown, the coat thrown on hastily, the gown incongruous beneath it, a detail that told Lena she hadn't gone back to wherever she was staying to change. She'd come directly, quickly, which told Lena something about the state she was in. Platinum hair catching the light, perfect posture. But the hands at her sides were not quite still. Damon approached first. Lena stayed 2 steps behind, close enough to be present, far enough to allow the conversation its space. Kara's voice in the earpiece. Thermal shows she's clean, no weapons, vehicle staged 2 blocks north, engine running. Could be her exit, or it could be a response team. Copy, Damon said. He stopped 10 feet from Serena. For a moment, the two of them simply regarded each other across the distance. The man who had built everything, and the woman who had been dismantling it from the inside. The particular unbearable intimacy of 2 people who had shared something genuine and something false simultaneously, and can no longer fully separate which was which. You brought her, Serena said. Her eyes moved to Lena. Something flickered in them, not hostility exactly, recognition perhaps, the acknowledgement of an equation that had refused to behave as planned. Her name is Lena, Damon said, and she's the only reason I'm standing here instead of lying in an alley behind Aurelius. Serena's gaze held Lena's for a moment. Then she looked back at Damon. I'm sorry, she said. For what it's worth, I truly am. I never wanted anyone to die. But you accepted it as a possibility. There's a difference between there isn't. Damon's voice was quiet and absolute. Acceptable losses is what military commanders say when they know people are going to die and have decided to proceed anyway. It's not a philosophical position. It's a decision. Serena was quiet. Why? Damon asked. Not the operational rationale. I understand that. Why you? Something moved across Serena Vale's face that was more honest than anything Lena had seen her produce all night. Not the pageant grief of the engagement toast. Not the cold operational composure of the foundry. Something raw and tired and old. I grew up with nothing, she said. Real nothing. Not the kind of nothing that rich people romanticize when they want to feel relatable. I was 12 years old eating food bank donations and lying to my teachers about why I didn't have gym shoes. Her voice was steady, but the effort of keeping it steady was visible. I spent 20 years constructing a version of myself that could survive in rooms like the ones you've always occupied. And then I met Graham, and he offered me a way to stop surviving and start winning. A pause. I convinced myself that people like you, people who were born standing on the platform, who never had to claw their way to the level you take for granted, that taking from you wasn't theft. It was redistribution. And Marcus, Lena said, the contractor and the foundry, they were also just redistribution. The silence that followed was different from the others, heavier, more specific. Serena closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, something had shifted. That wasn't supposed to happen, she said. Graham promised there would be no casualties beyond Damon, that the plan was surgical. Her voice carried the particular bitterness of someone who had been lied to in exactly the way they knew they might be lied to and chose to believe otherwise. I should have known better. You should have, Damon agreed. And you do, which is why you're here. Serena looked at him sharply. He's going to cut you loose, Damon said. Not eventually, soon. The moment you become a variable, he can't control a potential witness, a liability, someone who knows too much and has too many feelings about what she knows. He's going to eliminate you the same way he eliminated everyone else who outlived their usefulness. He took a step closer. You're not his partner, Serena. You were his most expensive tool, and tools don't get equity. Serena's jaw tightened. You don't know him. I know men like him. I've spent 15 years fighting them. He held her gaze. I know that right now there's a vehicle 2 blocks north with an engine running, and I know that the vehicle is either your exit or his response team, and I know that you don't actually know which one it is. The silence stretched. Lena watched Serena's face, watched the calculation and the emotion fighting each other in real time, the strategic intelligence that had constructed an 18-month deception doing battle with the part of her that had apparently meant it when she said she was sorry. Testify, Damon said. Full cooperation with federal prosecutors. You give them Slater every detail, every communication, every operational plan you were party to, and in exchange, I will personally advocate for the most favorable terms available. Immunity where possible. Reduce charges where immunity isn't possible. Protection for however long you need it. And if I refuse, then you face the same charges Slater faces. Conspiracy to commit murder. Corporate espionage. Money laundering. The contractor's death alone is enough to put you away for the rest of your life. He paused. And you'll face them without Graham Slater's resources because by the time his lawyers are done constructing his defense, you won't be a co-defendant. You'll be the fall guy. Serena's hands at her sides had become very still. Lena stepped forward. He told you it wasn't personal, she said quietly. When you accepted his proposal, when you stood in front of your friends and smiled and wore his ring, he told you this was business, that you could keep it clean. She met Serena's eyes. But Marcus Knox had a sister in Phoenix who called him every Sunday. The contractor in the foundry had a daughter who was 6 years old. Personal is exactly what this was. And you know it. You knew it the moment the shooting started and you realized Graham had been giving orders you didn't know about. Something broke in Serena Vale's face. Not dramatically, not with tears or declarations. Just a small internal fracture, the sound of a person's carefully constructed self-narrative losing structural integrity under the weight of the truth pressing against it from the inside. I can't testify against him, she said. Her voice had lost its architectural precision. If I turn on Graham, we can protect you, Damon said. Full witness protection if necessary. You help us build this case and you walk. You get to start over. You can't promise. I can try. He held her gaze with a steadiness that had nothing performative about it, which is more than Graham ever offered. The moment balanced on its edge, and then the first shot cracked across the water. The railing of the boathouse deck exploded in a spray of wood splinters 6 inches from Serena's hand. She screamed not a performance, not a rehearsed response, but the raw, involuntary sound of a body that has just understood with animal certainty that it is being killed. She dropped to her knees, hands over her head, the composure of the last 18 months shattered in a single second. More shots. Coming from the north from the direction of the staged vehicle. Kara's voice in the earpiece, sharp with something that was almost panic. Contact North 3 shooters, rooftop building across the street. Engaging now. Damon pulled Lena behind a stone planter, his body shielding hers. Gunfire and return fire created a strobe of sound across the park. People in the distance, late-night walkers screamed and ran. The lake's surface was briefly lit by muzzle flash, the reflections of violence dancing across the dark water. Serena, Chait, Damon called. Get down. Get behind. But Serena wasn't moving. She was kneeling on the open deck, utterly frozen, the collapse of every carefully maintained structure, leaving nothing behind capable of directing movement. She was exposed. She was a target, and the shooters were not missing by accident. They were not trying to frighten her. Slater had made his decision. Damon understood it at the same moment Lena did. She saw the understanding cross his face, something cold and certain, and then he was moving, sprinting across the open deck in a crouch, keeping low, moving in the pattern of a man who had trained for exactly this kind of terrain. Rounds cracked past him, 1-2 close enough that Lena, watching from behind the planter, felt the proximity of catastrophe like a physical thing. He reached Serena, grabbed her arm. They went down together behind the bench as a burst of automatic fire chewed through the air above. Vehicle moving, Kara's voice breathless. Black SUV heading to your position. 60 seconds. Slater's people, moving to finish it directly. Lena looked at the boathouse structure, the dock beneath the maintenance stairs leading down to the water level, the row of rental boats covered in winter tarps, the lake itself. An idea formed, a terrible, reckless, possibly fatal idea. She ran for it anyway. Damon, she called from the deck stairs already descending. The boats, a second's pause, then she heard him moving. The lower dock was shadowed, protected from the rooftop shooters by the overhang of the boathouse structure above. The lake lapped softly against the wooden pilings. A row of rental boats, small aluminum-hulled motorboats, sat under blue tarps, their outboards lifted for winter storage. Damon arrived with Serena's weight against his shoulder. The woman was barely ambulatory, not physically injured, but functionally incapacitated by the particular shock of discovering that the person she had trusted most had just ordered her death. The outboard? Lena said. She was already pulling the tarp off the nearest boat. Can you start it? I run a software company, not a marina. Then figure it out fast. He moved to the engine while Lena helped Serena into the boat, the woman going where directed with the passive compliance of someone whose decision-making apparatus had temporarily shut down. Above them on the deck, footsteps pounded. Voices shouted. The sound of a vehicle braking hard at the park entrance reached them even down here. Damon stripped the engine cover and found the ignition wiring with the focused speed of a man who approached mechanical problems the same way he approached financial ones. Find the architecture. Identify the essential components. Ignore everything else. Kara, he said into the earpiece. We're on the water, the dock, lower level. I've got 2 down on my side and 4 incoming from the north. Her voice was strained but controlled. Marcus is covering the vehicle. Tell Marcus to... He already knows. The engine coughed, sputtered, caught. Lena threw off the mooring line. Damon hit the throttle. The boat lurched forward, its ancient motor raising a protesting whine, and they were on the water, the Manhattan skyline reflected ahead of them in the dark lake, the boathouse falling away behind. Gunfire erupted from the dock above, late disordered the sound of people who had lost their target and were registering their frustration. Rounds hit the water 20 feet behind them, miniature geysers erupting and vanishing. Then a second engine sound, louder, more powerful. Lena looked back. Another boat. Larger, faster, moving away from the south dock, with 2 figures visible in the bow. They're following, she said. Damon looked back, assessed the distance, looked forward. The north shore was a distant line of trees and the faint geometry of the park's recreational structures. Head for the North Marina. If we can get into the dock maze, we can lose them. He raised his weapon and fired twice toward the pursuing boat, not aimed to kill, aimed to make the figures in the bow duck and buy time. It worked. The boat swerved. The distance held for a moment, but the gap was closing. 20 yards. 15. One of the figures raised a weapon. Serena moved. She had been sitting in the bow, head down, hands clasped in her lap, present in body and absent in every other sense. But when the gunman raised his weapon, aimed with the deliberate precision of a professional at Damon Cross's back, Serena Vale reached down into the bottom of the boat, picked up a wooden paddle and swung it with everything she had. The paddle connected with the barrel of the weapon precisely as the man fired. The shot went wide, cracking off to the right, raking empty water. The gunman snarled and grabbed for her. She pulled back, stumbled against the gunwale. Damon fired once. The first gunman folded and fell back into his own boat. The second gunman raised his weapon, aimed at Serena, who was exposed in the bow with nowhere to go. Lena jerked the wheel. The 2 boats collided with a jarring impact that threw everyone sideways, aluminum against fiberglass, the crack of the impact enormous in the nighttime park. The second gunman lost his balance. His shot went into the sky. He fell sideways into the lake with a splash that closed over him in seconds. Their boat was taking on water. The collision had punched a crease below the waterline. The bow was dropping, but the North Marina was there 50 yards, 30, 20, and Lena kept the throttle open until the last possible second and then drove them straight into the dock. The impact was controlled. Barely. The boat ground against the dock pilings and stopped. Damon was already moving, stepping onto the dock, turning back, reaching for Serena. He pulled her out of the sinking bow with both hands, and she came stumbling, bleeding from a gash on her arm that neither of them had noticed in the chaos. And then Serena's legs gave out. She sank to the dock and didn't fall exactly. It was more like deflating, like a person whose framework had finally relinquished the effort of maintaining upright posture, her back against a piling. Her immaculate clothes soaked and ruined, the platinum hair dark with water. She looked at Damon. Her eyes were glassy, unfocused. "I'm sorry," she said. The words came out very small. "Tell my mother I'm sorry." "You can tell her yourself." Damon knelt beside her. "Stay with me, Serena. Stay with me. Did I help?" The words were barely audible. Did I at the end? Did it matter? Yes. His voice cracked just slightly, just along a fault line he'd kept carefully sealed. You helped. You did good. She nodded. Her eyes found something distant. Her hand in Damon's went slack. The park was suddenly very quiet. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. The sound of Reed's response team arriving with whatever official resources he'd been able to mobilize. Red and blue light strobed through the trees to the south. Damon remained kneeling on the dock with Serena's hand in both of his, not moving, his expression carved from something that had taken 18 months to build and a single night to destroy. Lena sank down beside him. She didn't speak. She had spent 2 years learning when silence was the only appropriate response. Kara appeared from the tree line, blood on her jacket, limping slightly, her expression carefully blank. She took one look at the dock, and something moved through her face before she sealed it away. Reed was right behind her. He assessed the scene in a single sweep and said quietly, "Police are 30 seconds out. We need a story." "The truth," Damon said. He didn't look up. "We tell them the truth, all of it." A pause. "Sirs, she died trying to make this right." He carefully lowered Serena's hand to the dock. Then he stood slowly and turned to face whatever was coming through the trees. "The least I can do is honor that." He raised his hands as the first officers arrived, and Lena stood beside him, hands raised, her face tilted up toward the cold February sky, and felt the weight of the night settling into her bones, not crushing, not unbearable, but real. Heavy with consequence. Heavy with what had been lost and what had been saved, and the impossible, irreducible fact that those two things were always somehow the same weight. The police came. The story began. The next 6 hours were a blur of police interviews, medical examinations, and the particular legal coordination that Reed Knox had apparently been preparing for, or something like it, for years. They processed Lena in a conference room at the 20th precinct that smelled of old coffee and institutional carpet. 3 different detectives, 3 different sessions, each one walking her through the same sequence from the beginning. The dining room at Aurelius, the overheard conversation, the napkin, the restaurant attack, the foundry, the boathouse, with the methodical thoroughness of people building a structure they intended to be load-bearing. She told it the same way each time, not because she had rehearsed it, but because it had happened. The truth she had discovered had a particular internal consistency that manufactured accounts rarely achieved. Every detail connected to every other detail in the organic, imperfect way that experience connected to experience. The detectives probed for inconsistencies and found none because there were none, and each time she completed the sequence, she watched the atmosphere in the room shift slightly from skeptical to convinced, from convinced to grimly purposeful. By the 4th hour, she was running on adrenaline fumes and bad coffee. By the 6th, the story was shifting. Reed's legal team had delivered the evidence package surveillance footage from Aurelius's external cameras, showing coordinated tactical entry. Jonas's server data from the foundry reconstructed and annotated with forensic technical analysis. Financial records tracing the shell companies back through 4 corporate tiers to a law firm that had Slater Capital as its principal client. And most critically, Serena's dying declaration captured on the body camera of a patrol officer who had arrived at the marina in time to hear the last 2 minutes of her life. The declaration had been heard by 4 witnesses. 2 of them carried badges. The declaration was on digital record. When Damon was released from his own interview at 6:47 in the morning, the news ticker in the precinct's waiting area was running a different story than the one Slater had planned. Not tech CEO sought in restaurant violence. Not billionaire's mental breakdown. The Chiron's red CEO target of assassination plot and coordinated attack confirmed by law enforcement sources, and bombshell engagement Slater, Capital CEO, implicated in murder conspiracy. The narrative had turned, slowly, painfully, but it was turning. Lena was sitting in a plastic chair in the hallway when Damon emerged from the interview room, flanked by 2 lawyers who looked like they had been drafted from their beds and arrived dressed for battle despite it. He dismissed them with a word and a gesture and crossed to where she was sitting. He looked as worn as she had ever seen a person look. Not tired exactly, but emptied the way a landscape looks after a storm has passed through it, when the air is clean and still and the evidence of violence is everywhere, but the violence itself is gone. He sat down next to her, not across from her, next to her. They're moving on the Connecticut estate, he said. Federal warrants, tactical teams. They'll hit it at 8 a.m. Slater. Not yet accounted for. A pause. He wasn't at the boathouse when the police arrived. He had a separate exit from the foundry. His people pulled him out before the building was contained. Lena was quiet for a moment. He's running. He thinks he's repositioning. Damon looked at the news ticker across the room. There's a difference in his mind. Running implies defeat. Repositioning implies a next move. Is there one always for men like him? He paused. But Jonas made copies of everything before the foundry servers were physically compromised. Multiple copies distributed to multiple secure locations. Slater can destroy the original equipment. He can't destroy what was already extracted. A thin, cold smile. He's running from an evidence trail that has already left the building. Lena let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. They sat in the plastic chairs in the fluorescent hallway of the 20th precinct and said nothing for a while, and it was the most restful silence Lena had experienced in what felt like years. She meant it, Lena said finally. When she said she loved you, that part was real. Damon didn't answer immediately. I know, he said at last. That's what makes it harder. If it had all been performance from the beginning, if every moment had been a lie, it would be cleaner. He looked at the middle distance. But she meant it and still chose everything else. Which means love wasn't enough. Which means I put everything I had into something that wasn't. He stopped. It was enough, Lena said. It just wasn't everything. People can love genuinely and still be broken in ways that love can't fix. That's not your failure. That's just the full, complicated, terrible truth about human beings. He looked at her sideways. You're going to be a very good lawyer, say, he said. I know, she said, and she meant it. They took Lena to the Tribeca apartment that evening. Reed had arranged it clean, secure, staffed around the clock, the kind of place that existed in the upper register of Manhattan real estate without announcing itself to the street. 3 bedrooms, floor-to-ceiling windows facing west, a kitchen stocked with everything and used by no one. She stood at the window for a long time and watched the lights of the city. The nightmares started the second night. They came reliably, the restaurant attack, in slow motion, the server room's muzzle flash, the sound of the boat collision. Serena's hand going slack. She woke gasping, disoriented, reaching for a lamp that wasn't where lamps usually were, and sat on the edge of the bed until her heart rate convinced her nervous system that the room was safe. On the 4th morning, she called the number that Damon's office had left on the kitchen counter, along with information about the therapist who specialized in crisis trauma and survivor response. She made an appointment. She considered it a small act of courage, and she allowed herself to feel that. The trial date was set within 3 weeks of Slater's arrest, which when it came was cinematic in its banality. No dramatic standoff. No final speech. Graham Slater was taken into custody at a private airport in New Jersey, mid-boarding his luggage already loaded on a chartered flight to Zurich, when federal agents came through the terminal doors with warrants and body cameras, and the quiet certainty of people who had spent 3 weeks building an airtight case and were now delivering its conclusion. He was processed and charged, 43 counts. His legal team was spectacular. Lena read their filings with genuine professional admiration, noting the sophistication of the motions and the elegance of the arguments, and utterly overmatched. The evidence was layered, cross-referenced, and sourced through official channels that Slater's lawyers could challenge individually, but not collectively. Jonas had built a forensic architecture that told the story from a dozen independent angles simultaneously. Serena's recorded declaration provided the human testimony that connected the data points to human consequence. The trial was set to begin in 6 weeks. In the interim, Lena went back to Columbia. She walked through the law school's entrance on a gray morning in late March with her shoulders straight and her student ID in her pocket, and the particular feeling of someone returning to a room they were asked to leave before the work was finished. The administrative process had been handled by Damon's legal team in 3 days re-enrollment financial arrangements scheduling. Technically efficient, but the moment of walking through the door was hers, and she felt every step of it. Her property law professor looked up when she settled into a seat in the 3rd row. Ms. Hart, he said, with a particular emphasis that suggested he had read the news. Professor, she said, and that was that. The seminar began. The work resumed. She testified on the third day of the trial. She had been prepared by the prosecution team in 4 sessions that were rigorous, thorough, and occasionally brutal in their simulation of cross-examination. She had been told what to expect from the defense attorney, a man named Cartwright, who had the silver-tongued confidence of someone who had spent 30 years turning juries around in the final hours of deliberation. She had been told that he would attack her credibility, her motives, her mental state, the reliability of her memory under stress. She had been told to remain calm, to stick to what she had directly witnessed, and to resist the temptation to argue. She had not been told that standing in front of a jury would feel exactly like standing in front of the VIP room door at Aurelius with a folded napkin in her hand, the same compressed clarity, the same understanding that the decision had already been made, and what remained was only execution. Cartwright came after her for 40 minutes. He suggested she had misheard. She said she had not. He suggested she had misidentified the voice. She said she had not. He suggested she had fabricated the conversation for financial gain, citing the scholarship fund and the position at Cross as evidence of a transaction rather than a reward. She looked at him steadily. "Everything I received from Mr. Cross came after I testified to what I had directly witnessed," she said. "I received nothing in advance, and I was offered nothing in advance. I spoke because a man's life was in danger, and I had information that could protect him. That is the complete account." Cartwright changed tactics. He suggested she was unreliable, a dropout with a history of financial instability, a woman who had been operating under extreme stress. "I had been working 12-hour shifts for 3 years," she said. "I had been managing financial stress, sleep deprivation, and grief for 3 years. I was accustomed to operating under pressure." She paused. "What I heard outside that VIP room, I heard clearly. What I understood it to mean, I understood correctly. And what I chose to do about it, I did deliberately, with full knowledge of the risk. I would make the same choice again." The cross-examination ended. Cartwright sat down. In the gallery, Lena caught Damon's eye for a fraction of a second. He nodded once, a small, precise acknowledgement that said everything it needed to without saying anything that could be read by a courtroom. She stepped down from the witness stand. The trial continued. In week 3, the prosecution played the video from Serena's phone recovered from her personal effects by the first officers at the marina scene, unlocked by her biometric data via court order containing 53 minutes of audio and video captured by Serena herself in the hours before her death. Insurance, perhaps, or evidence she had been collecting in the event that things went wrong, and she found herself needing leverage of her own. Whatever her intention, the video contained everything. Slater's voice giving operational orders, Serena's voice reluctant but participating, the transfer code structure, the timeline, the phrase repeated specific, unmistakable, acceptable losses. The courtroom was completely silent as the recording played. The judge's expression was stone. When the video finished, Slater's lead attorney rose and requested a recess, in a voice that had, for the first time in 3 weeks, lost its performative confidence. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When the foreperson stood and read the verdicts, she read them in sequence, all 43 counts, and each one landed in the courtroom like a stone dropped in still water. Guilty. 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 Every single one. The morning after the boathouse, Reed Knox convened the group at the 15th floor command center at 7:30 a.m. and laid out the situation with the direct clarity of someone who understood that clarity was the only useful gift in the aftermath of violence. "Slater left the foundry before we arrived," he said. "His people pulled him out through the rooftop. No confirmed location. The warrants are moving federal level. Connecticut Estate, 8 a.m. "I'm going," Damon said. Reed looked at him. "Sir." "I promised Serena." Damon held his gaze. "I keep my promises." He looked at Lena. She didn't need him to ask. The convoy assembled in 90 minutes, police tactical units. Federal agents, 2 SUVs from Damon's detail, and moved up I-95 as the April morning strengthened the city receding behind them, the weight of an operation that had been building for months pressing forward into its final sequence. Slater's Connecticut estate was massive. 3 floors, 20 rooms, grounds running to a private dock on the Sound. In summer, it would be spectacular. At 8:02 in the morning, with federal agents moving through every entrance and helicopter rotors overhead, it looked like what it was, The fortress of a man who had built his life around the principle that consequences were for other people. The gates were open. The security system was disabled. Slater was gone. Lena's stomach dropped with the specific weight of a hope released too suddenly. After everything, the restaurant, the foundry, the boathouse, Serena's death, after all of it, he had walked away. But Reed was smiling, cold and professional. He left the servers. They found them in the basement, exactly where Serena had described rows of black equipment, still running, status lights blinking with quiet confirmation that the data was intact. Jonas moved to the nearest terminal. "It's all here," Jonas said, his voice building as he worked. "Every transaction, every communication, every shell company and routing code." He looked up. He didn't wipe it. "He didn't have time," Damon said. "Or—" He moved to the server rack. Something was running active, not passive. Network activity. Jonas pulled up the monitoring interface. His hands accelerated. "Outbound traffic, live streaming. He's accessing these servers remotely." A pause. "He's watching us right now." The room went still. "Trace it." Jonas's fingers moved in the rapid percussive way of someone for whom keyboards were a native language. Less than a minute. "The signal is originating from Brooklyn." He pulled up a map. The foundry's satellite outline appeared on the screen. "He never left." Damon and Lena looked at each other. "He's been in the safe room the whole time," Damon said, "watching everything on remote monitoring, watching us chase him to Connecticut while he sat in a climate-controlled room in Brooklyn with food, water, and the most powerful insurance policy he could construct." His jaw hardened, "waiting for us to give up." "Then we don't give up." The foundry in daylight was ordinary in its decay. Crumbling brick rust weeds pushing through cracked concrete with the patient persistence of nature, reclaiming what had been temporarily borrowed. They found the safe room on the second floor behind a standard office door that was anything but titanium frame reinforced steel door, military-grade biometric lock. Months of preparation, planned from the beginning. The tactical commander studied it. "We can breach, shape charges, an hour." "Announce first," Damon said. He knocked. 3 times. Patient. 10 seconds of silence. Then the speaker panel crackled. "Damon!" Slater's voice was precisely what it had been in the foundry's third-floor office, amused, unhurried, the performance of composure that had become indistinguishable from the real thing. "I didn't think you'd make it this far." "It's over, Graham." "Is it?" A pause filled with a specific kind of pleasure. "I have a dead man's switch. If I don't check in every 12 hours, everything I've collected over 20 years files on CEOs, judges, politicians, releases to every major outlet simultaneously. You force me out of this room and I burn the whole system down." Damon was quiet for a moment. "You're bluffing," he said. Silence. "If you release that information, you lose your only protection." Damon continued, conversational, explaining something to someone intelligent enough to follow it. "Those powerful people you're threatening don't respond through lawyers. They respond through other means. You're only alive because your secrets are still secret. Release them and you become a liability to every person on that list." He paused. "Which means you'd be dead before the news cycle finished." Longer silence. "Here's my offer," Damon said. "You open this door. You surrender. You get a fair trial, top attorneys, every legal protection available." He paused. "Or you stay in that room and I make it my mission to dismantle everything you have left through every method available to someone with my resources. When you finally emerge, and you will emerge, there will be nothing left." The silence that followed was the longest of the morning. Then with a soft, mechanical clunk that was the most satisfying sound Lena had heard in weeks, the biometric lock disengaged. The steel door swung open. Graham Slater stood in the doorway, hands raised, suit immaculate, the performance maintained until the final second. He looked at Damon with something that might have been in another life professional respect. "Well played," he said. Then his eyes moved to Lena. The respect became something colder. "The waitress," he said. "You started all of this with your little note. I hope you're proud of yourself." She met his gaze. She didn't feel triumph. She felt tired and sad and clear. in the way that arrived only after a long and costly journey. "I am," she said. They arrested him in the doorway of his own safe room, the morning light falling through broken skylights above federal agents reading him his rights with professional patience. He didn't resist. He stepped forward and let it happen. As they led him toward the stairs, he looked back once. "This isn't over," he said. "For you it is," Damon replied. The explosion came without warning. One moment, Lena was standing on the foundry floor watching the federal agents work, and the next a percussion wave slammed into her chest and threw her sideways into Damon as the east wing detonated. The sound was enormous. Not a crack, but a deep foundational concussion felt in the bones before the ears could process it. The floor shook. Dust cascaded from the ceiling in thick curtains. A secondary explosion followed, deeper, more fundamental. The groan of structural steel pushed past tolerance. "Servers were rigged to blow," Reed's voice sharp. "Backup plan. If he couldn't have the evidence, nobody could." Damon grabbed Lena's arm. "Move!" They moved. The building was collapsing in sequence, not catastrophically, all at once, but progressively, the chain of structural failures propagating through the east wing with terrible grinding inevitability. Kara's voice: "East stairwell is gone. West stairwell has maybe 90 seconds before the support columns fail." "Loading dock," Lena said. She just knew. "The tunnel. Same way we came in." They ran across the factory floor through smoke and falling plaster. The world reduced to the reach of phone lights, Damon's hand on her arm, Reed behind them. Federal agents streamed out through the main entrance, the sound of professional tactical withdrawal, organized and purposeful, even in the middle of a building dying around them. The loading dock, the tunnel entrance, the same rusted grate, the same gap, the same darkness below. Lena went through first. The tunnel shook. Dust fell from the ceiling in thick curtains. The sound of the collapse came through the earth around them as a continuous deep vibration. Not the percussion of explosions, but the slow, inevitable settling of tons of material finding its new geometry. 200 yards, 100, 50. They burst into the alley, gasping, covered in dust and concrete residue smelling of smoke and old earth. Lena doubled over and coughed until her lungs felt clean. Behind them, the foundry was completing its descent, the building folding floor by floor with the particular sound of large things surrendering to larger forces. Smoke poured from every opening. The morning had been shattered into something louder and more violent and more honest than the quiet industrial decay this neighborhood had been pretending to for decades. And across the street, standing in the gathering crowd of neighbors, and the curious watching the smoke rise with his hands in the pockets of his expensive coat, Graham Slater. He had slipped his police escort in the explosion's chaos. He stood free, watching his final insurance policy activate, watching the servers burn, watching what he believed was the evidence of his crimes becoming ash and structural debris. His expression was the composed, satisfied look of a man who has just successfully played his last card. He turned, sensed their attention across the crowd, found Damon's eyes. He smiled, the broken, bitter smile of a man who believes he has preserved enough to come back from anything. He gave them a small, mocking salute, then turned and walked away into the crowd. Damon moved to follow. Reed's hand on his arm stopped him. "Don't. Let him think he's free." "He is free. He's in a box." Reed's phone was already out. "Before we went to Connecticut this morning, Jonas distributed everything we pulled from the servers. Multiple copies, 3 state distribution cloud backups, safety deposit boxes. He just destroyed his own evidence. We kept ours." Reed smiled with the coldness of someone who has been several moves ahead for hours. "And in 60 seconds, he'll be on camera fleeing custody and watching a building he owns burn. Consciousness of guilt, obstruction, 12 additional felony counts we can prove without server data." A police helicopter appeared overhead, its camera pointed down. At the street, at the crowd, at Graham Slater in his distinctive coat walking away from the smoke. He heard the rotors. Looked up. For the first time in Lena's entire experience of him, she watched real uncertainty cross his face, the actual fear of a man who has realized mid-play that the board is not the way he thought it was. He walked faster, then ran. Police units materialized from both ends of the block, the coordinated containment that Reed had been staging for the past 40 minutes, while Slater watched the building burn and congratulated himself. Graham Slater stopped in the middle of the street, surrounded by officers, by cameras, by the undeniable public reality of a man who had run out of room. He stood there for a long moment, and then slowly, with the finality of something long overdue, he raised his hands and went to his knees on the asphalt. They arrested him for the last time in the middle of the street, in front of witnesses and cameras and the smoking remnants of his final gambit. As they walked him to the vehicle, he looked back one last time across the police cordon and found Damon. No smile, no amused composure, just rage, pure and impotent, the actual face beneath all the architecture stripped of every layer the years had built around it. Damon held his gaze and said nothing. They drove Graham Slater away. Yep. Sentencing came 2 weeks after the verdict on a Tuesday morning in early April, when the sky over lower Manhattan was the pale, washed-out blue of a city that had been through something and was still deciding how to feel about it. The courtroom was full. The press section overflowed into the gallery. Damon sat in the front row of the public area, not as a party to proceedings at this point, but as the central surviving victim, and as something else that had no official designation, the person who had more than any other refused to allow the thing that happened that February night to be buried under legal motions and narrative management. Lena sat beside him. She had dressed carefully, a dark blazer over a clean white shirt, the first pieces of clothing she had purchased specifically for this purpose, rather than because they were functional or affordable. It felt like armor. It felt like something her father would have approved of. Graham Slater was led in wearing an expensive suit that his personal assistant had apparently been allowed to deliver to his holding facility. And Lena looked at him across the distance of the courtroom and thought about the moment on the Foundry's third floor, when he had been standing behind his mahogany desk with a glass of whiskey and a smile and the absolute unhurried confidence of a man who believed he had already won. That confidence was gone. Not entirely, there was still something in the set of his jaw and the way he held himself that suggested the habit of authority, the muscle memory of a man who had spent 30 years in rooms where his presence organized the space. But it was performative now, in a way it hadn't been before. The confidence was something he was doing, rather than something he was. The judge entered. Everyone stood. Everyone sat. The victim impact statements went first. Lena did not give one she had chosen not to on the advice of the prosecutors who had told her that her written testimony spoke for itself and her presence in the courtroom would carry its own weight. Marcus Knox's sister did. She was from Phoenix, mid-30s, with her brother's same steady eyes and the particular composure of a person who has been holding something together for months and is finally in this room allowed to set it down. She spoke for 11 minutes. She talked about her brother's laugh, about the way he had called her every Sunday without fail, regardless of where he was or what he was doing, and about how the Sunday after his death she had sat by the phone for 3 hours before she believed it wasn't going to ring. She talked about his daughter, 5 years old now, who asked questions about her uncle that her mother answered with the careful, patient love of someone laying down architecture that would have to bear weight for decades. When she finished, this courtroom was silent, in the specific way that large spaces go silent, when the people inside them are all experiencing the same thing simultaneously. Slater's attorney made a statement about mitigating factors and the complexity of the circumstances, and his client's distinguished career and contributions to the financial technology sector. It was competent and entirely unsuccessful. The judge listened with an expression that suggested she had heard this argument in various forms throughout her career and found it no more persuasive this time than on any previous occasion. The sentence 35 years to be served consecutively without possibility of parole for 20. With his age and his current health, the stress of the past months had visibly cost him the silver temples. Now fully white, the predatory sharpness softened into something haggard. It was effectively a life sentence. As the officers moved to lead him away, Slater looked across the courtroom and found Damon. The rage there was real, unperformed, unmanaged. The actual Graham Slater stripped of the expensive packaging and the carefully constructed persona. Just a man who had arranged his entire existence around the belief that he was exceptional enough to be exempt from the consequences his actions produced in other people. "You won the battle," Slater said, his voice carried. "But the game never ends cross. Men like me, we don't disappear. Someone will rise up after me. That's how the world works. You know it as well as I do." Damon held his gaze. Maybe, he said, but they'll have to go through people like Lena first. He paused. And I'm betting on her. They led Graham Slater away. The courtroom exhaled. Lena sat very still for a moment and let the finality of it arrive: the verdict, the sentence, the fact of his diminishment from the immense operational threat of 7 weeks ago to a man in handcuffs being walked through a door by 2 officers who were already thinking about their lunch. The gap between those 2 things was not satisfying in the way she might have expected. It was true and necessary and right, but it was not the clean resolution of a story with a shape. Real things never were. Damon's hand found hers briefly, a single steady pressure, and then he released it and stood because the lawyers were waiting and the work, as it always did, continued. Well, the civil cases resolved faster than the criminal ones, which was simply how the machinery of consequence worked when money was involved and the billable hours on both sides were high enough to motivate speed. Slater Capital's corporate structure collapsed progressively across 3 weeks, each subsidiary filing for protection. In sequence, the whole architecture Slater had built over 30 years unwinding like a thread pulled from a sweater. The beneficial assets were absorbed, the legal obligations were assigned, the shell companies were dissolved. Damon recovered what had been targeted. And then, because the civil settlements gave him access to Slater Capital's financial records through discovery, he found what none of them had known about the historical fraud: the client accounts that had been quietly leveraged against their owner's knowledge for years. The pattern of exploitation that had funded Slater's lifestyle and generated his power. The amount recovered from civil proceedings exceeded the amount that had nearly been stolen by a factor of 4. The Kellerman merger closed without incident 3 days after the verdict. Cross Industries' stock price reached a record high on the day of the merger announcement. The financial press wrote extensively about what they characterized as Damon Cross's remarkable resilience and the vindication of his strategic vision. Lena read the coverage in her Tribeca apartment and noted with a kind of detached professional observation that the coverage mentioned her name in precisely 2 articles, both of which described her as a key witness rather than the person who had initiated the entire chain of events with a handwritten note on a cocktail napkin. She found she didn't mind. Invisibility, it turned out, had its uses. The scholarship fund was announced in late April. Damon had told her about it 3 weeks earlier in his office, the formal conversation that concluded the period of their relationship that had been defined by crisis, and began the period that would be defined by whatever came next. He had shown her the documents with the straightforwardness of someone who had made a decision and wasn't interested in performing uncertainty about it. The Michael Hart Memorial Scholarship, he said. Full ride, living expenses included, 10 recipients per year with priority consideration for students from low-income backgrounds pursuing law degrees. The first cohort enrolls in September. Lena had read the document, then read it again. My father's name, she said. Your father's dream. You told me about him, about dropping out to take care of him, about what he believed you could become. Damon's expression was direct but not unkind. This seemed like the right way to honor that, not just for you, for others who are in the position you were in. She had not cried in his office. She had held it together with the particular discipline of a person who has learned to process large emotional events in private rather than performing them in front of audiences. But she had sat in her car afterward in the parking structure for 45 minutes. And the tears that came were the kind that arrived after something is over. Not grief exactly, but the physical release of a pressure that had been building for 3 years. Her father would have called it justice. He had believed in that word in the uncomplicated way that people believed in it when they had never been betrayed by its implementation. When you went through what Lena had gone through, you came out on the other side with a more complicated relationship to the concept. Justice happened. Imperfectly. Painfully. With cost. But it happened. The first scholarship recipients were announced 6 weeks later. Lena read through their acceptance letters on a Sunday afternoon. 10 people who had been in various ways standing where she had stood capable, committed, stopped by the wrong combination of circumstances at the wrong moment. The letters were formal and careful, and beneath the formality she could hear something she recognized: the particular disbelief of someone being told that the door they thought was closed was in fact open. She cried again, less controlled this time. She decided she was okay with that. The position that Dahmen offered her was not what she had expected. Head of Ethics and Compliance. She had expected something more traditionally transactional, a role in the legal department perhaps, or something in corporate governance that leveraged her specific knowledge of the Slater case. The ethics role was larger, more exposed, and more genuinely consequential than any position she could have anticipated. "I'm not qualified," she said. "You're more qualified than anyone I could hire from the conventional pool." He slid the position description across the desk. "You've seen what happens when a company's internal ethics infrastructure is either absent or captured by the people it's supposed to police. You've lived the consequences. That's not something they teach at any school." She read the description carefully. It was ambitious, the kind of role that would require her to push back against powerful people, to ask uncomfortable questions in comfortable rooms, to be the person in meetings who said the thing nobody wanted to hear. The kind of role her father would have recognized and understood because he had spent his career as the person on job sites who pointed out when the work wasn't right, even when the timeline was tight and the client was impatient. "I haven't finished my law degree," she said. "Finish it. I'm creating an interim consulting role, ethics consultant, working part-time while you complete your degree. You build knowledge of the company. You build relationships. When you graduate, the full position is waiting. And if I decide it's not what I want, then you decide." He met her eyes steadily. "I'm not asking for a commitment. I'm offering a path. What you do with it is yours." She accepted. And summer arrived the way Manhattan summers did. Abruptly. Completely. The cold spring replaced overnight by heat that rose from the asphalt in visible waves and made the city feel both electric and exhausted. Lena's course load at Columbia was demanding in the way she had missed the kind of intellectual challenge that required full engagement rather than just endurance. Property law, constitutional theory, administrative procedure. She sat in seminar rooms and participated in discussions and pulled straight A's on every exam and felt for the first time in 3 years that she was using the full range of whatever she was. Kara checked in regularly. Range time, she called it, the two of them, at a shooting range in Queens where Kara had worked with Lena on the particular kind of calm that made being in a loud, threatening space less viscerally destabilizing. They didn't talk about the night at the Foundry directly. They talked around it the way people who have been through something together talked about it, through context and reference, and the occasional moment when something specific was acknowledged and then released. "You're better," Kara said one afternoon, watching Lena run through a target sequence with controlled, deliberate shots. "At this, at everything." Kara ejected her own magazine and began reloading with the automatic efficiency of long practice. "The first time you came in here, you jumped every time the person in the lane next to us fired. Now you don't even blink." "I learned from a professional." Kara's mouth twitched. "Don't get sentimental. I'm still charging Damon for my time." Reed stopped by the apartment every 2 weeks with updates on the ongoing proceedings against Slater's operational network. The people who had provided the tactical team for the restaurant attack, the lawyers who had structured the shell companies with knowledge of their fraudulent purpose, the intermediaries who had connected Slater to the contractor in the Foundry. The case was thorough and far-reaching and would take years to fully resolve. But it was moving. Jonas appeared on Tuesday mornings for what he called security audits, and which functioned primarily as tutorials in digital self-protection. He had a teaching instinct beneath the technical persona, the ability to find the right analogy for a concept to gauge understanding and adjust accordingly. She learned from him how to recognize the architecture of manipulation, how to see the structural patterns in seemingly random data, how to ask the question that the surface presentation was designed to prevent you from asking. "You know," he said one Tuesday, "you learn this stuff faster than most of our security team." "I'm motivated. I noticed." He closed his laptop. "Can I ask you something? You're going to regardless. That night at the Foundry when you stopped the transfer, were you scared?" Lena considered the question honestly. "Yes, completely. But you kept going." "I had to." Jonas nodded slowly. "I think about it sometimes. What I would have done in your position. Whether I would have just—" He stopped. "You would have done what was necessary," Lena said. "You do it every day. You just do it differently." He thought about that for a moment. "Different tools," so he said. Same principle. But the evening that stays in memory most clearly from that summer is a warm night in late May on the roof garden of Daumann's Manhattan penthouse. The kind of evening that a city produces occasionally as though in apology. For all the difficulty, the temperature exactly right, the skyline, doing what it does when the light is low and the air is clear, which is to look like something that was specifically designed to make human beings feel that beauty is possible. They were drinking wine. Simple. No performance. Lena had just finished her first week back in full course load at Columbia Law. The week had been demanding and energizing and had reminded her of something she had almost let herself forget, that she was genuinely, fundamentally good at this. Not just functional, not just competent, good. "How does it feel?" Damon asked. "Like reclaiming something," she said. "Like going back to a room you were asked to leave before you finished the work." "And the work, does it feel worth doing now that you know what it looks like in practice? The system. Its limits." Lena looked at the skyline. "More," she said, "not less. Because now I know what happens when it fails. Which means I know exactly what we're building toward when we try to make it better." Damon was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about Serena," he said. The name came out carefully, the way names came out when you were still deciding how to carry them. "About what she said. That she did it because she was afraid of going back to being nobody. That the fear was stronger than the ethics." "I think about it too," Lena said. "Do you understand it?" "Yes." No hesitation. "I spent 3 years being invisible. Working doubles, owing money, watching people I served not see my face. There were nights when I thought, if I stayed on this path, if this was the rest of my life." She stopped. "Let the honesty sit for a second. I understand the fear of insignificance, the way it hollows you out. But you didn't make the same choice." "I had a different moment." She turned to look at him. "I had a pen in my hand and 5 words I could write down. That was my moment. That's all it was." She paused. "Serena's moments led her somewhere else. I don't know how much of that was character and how much was circumstance. I'm not sure I ever will." Damon considered this. "She saved my life at the end," he said quietly. "That counts." "It counts." They drank their wine. The city below moved through its evening, the lights multiplying as the sky darkened the traffic, thinning the particular ambient frequency of 8 million people settling into the end of a day. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you," Damon said. "Ask." "The morning after the restaurant, when you gave me your testimony for the 3rd time and the detective asked you whether you would do it again knowing what it would cost you." He looked at her. "You answered immediately. You said yes." "I remember." "How—" Lena thought about the question the way it deserved, seriously, without deflection. "Because my father believed in a version of me that I had almost given up on believing in myself," she said. "And when I stood in that corridor and heard what they were planning and chose to do something about it, I was the person he believed I was. Not almost that person. Actually, that person." She met his eyes. "Once you've been that person, you can't be anyone smaller. The choice makes you." The silence between them had the quality of something settled. "He would have been proud," Damon said. "I know," she said, and she let herself feel the truth of it. Not the familiar ache of his absence, but something warmer, something that coexisted with the grief rather than competing with it. Pride traveling in one direction and gratitude traveling back. They sat together as the sky completed its transition from blue to black, and the city became the thing it became at night, not less than itself, but differently beautiful, the darkness giving the lights their meaning. Below, somewhere in lower Manhattan, Slater's former offices were being cleared and cataloged by federal receivers. The Kellerman merger had transformed the competitive landscape of the cloud security industry in ways that analysts were still working through. The scholarship fund had received 400 applications for its first 10 spots. And somewhere in a federal correctional facility in Pennsylvania, a man was beginning to understand that there was no repositioning left to do, only time and its passage and the daily reality of the life his choices had constructed. None of it was clean. None of it was perfect. The story of what had happened at Aurelius on that February night would be written and rewritten for years in courtrooms and academic papers and wherever people gathered to discuss the ways that corporate power and human vulnerability and the refusal of ordinary people to look away converged into something that briefly illuminated what was usually kept dark. Lena would be part of that story. She had accepted that. But she was not only that story. She was also a law student in her third year with a focus in corporate ethics who had a standing Tuesday morning security briefing with a tech specialist, standing range sessions with a former Marine, and a standing dinner commitment on the 15th of each month with the man whose life she had saved with a pen and a napkin and the willingness to act. She was also, and primarily, and most importantly, the person her father had always believed she would become. That was enough. That was everything. She raised her glass. To second chances, she said. Damon raised his. To the people who make them possible. They drank. The wine tasted like the end of one story and the beginning of another, which was... Lena was learning the taste of most good things. Outside, the November wind was already in the air, the turning of seasons, the approach of the year's accounting, the reminder that time moved forward whether you were ready or not, and that the only useful response to that fact was to be as fully present as possible in the time you were given. Lena was present. She was here on this rooftop, in this city, in this life she had refused to let go of even when letting go would have been easier. She had scars that would always ache in cold weather. She had nightmares that came less frequently now, but had not entirely stopped. She had a grief for her father that was simply part of the architecture of who she was and would never be fully resolved. She had also stopped a multi-billion-dollar theft with a line of code she barely remembered how to write. She had testified in federal court against one of the most powerful men in the financial industry and done not flinch once. She had stood in a room where everything was going wrong and chosen to be the kind of person who did the thing that needed to be done. She was that person. She would remain that person. The city spread below them, brilliant and indifferent and full of human lives being lived in all their ordinary complexity, each one containing its own impossible stories, its own moments where someone had to decide who they were going to be. Lena had made her decision. She was just getting started. The courtroom was full on sentencing day. The press section overflowed into the gallery. Damon sat in the front row, not as a party to proceedings at this point, but as the central surviving victim, and as something else that had no official designation, the person who had more than any other refused to allow what happened that February night to be buried under legal motions and narrative management. Lena sat beside him. She had dressed carefully, a dark blazer over a clean white shirt, the first pieces of clothing she had purchased specifically for this purpose, rather than because they were functional or affordable. It felt like armor. It felt like something her father would have approved of. Graham Slater was led in wearing an expensive suit that his personal assistant had apparently been allowed to deliver to his holding facility, and Lena looked at him across the distance of the courtroom and thought about the moment on the Foundry's third floor when he had been standing behind his mahogany desk with a glass of whiskey and the absolute unhurried confidence of a man who believed he had already won. That confidence was gone. Not entirely, there was still something in the set of his jaw and the way he carried himself that spoke of the habit of authority, the muscle memory of a man who had spent 30 years in rooms where his presence organized the space around it. But it was performative now, in a way it hadn't been before. The confidence was something he was doing rather than something he was. The judge entered. Everyone stood. Everyone sat. The victim impact statements went first. Lena had chosen not to give one. The prosecutors had told her that her testimony already spoke for itself and her presence in the courtroom would carry its own weight. Marcus Knox's sister gave one. She was from Phoenix, mid-30s, with her brother's same steady eyes and the particular composure of a person who has been holding something together for months and is finally in this room allowed to set it down. She spoke for 11 minutes. She talked about Marcus's laugh, about the way he had called her every Sunday without fail, regardless of where he was or what he was doing, about the Sunday after his death when she sat by the phone for 3 hours before she believed it wasn't going to ring. She talked about his daughter, 5 years old now, who asked questions about her uncle that her mother answered with the careful, patient love of someone laying down architecture that would have to bear weight for decades. When she finished, the courtroom was silent in the specific way that large spaces go silent when everyone inside them is experiencing the same thing simultaneously. Slater's attorney made a statement about mitigating factors and his client's distinguished career and contributions to the industry. It was competent and entirely unsuccessful. The sentence, 35 years to be served consecutively without possibility of parole for 20. With his age, the stress of the preceding months had visibly cost him the silver temples now fully white. The predatory sharpness softened into something haggard. It was effectively a life sentence. The mathematics were unavoidable, and Slater understood them. She could see the understanding move through his face like weather. The realization of a man who had always believed that his intelligence and resources would ultimately produce a way out of any situation, finally confronting a situation with no way out. As they moved to lead him away, Slater looked across the courtroom and found Damon. The rage there was real, unperformed, unmanaged, the actual Graham Slater, stripped of every layer of expensive construction that had made him for 30 years a man other men both feared and emulated. "You won the battle," he said, his voice carried through the courtroom's charged silence. "But the game never ends, Cross. Men like me, we don't disappear. Someone else will rise up. That's how the world works. You know it as well as I do." Damon held his gaze. "Maybe," he said, "but they'll have to go through people like Lena first." A pause. "And I'm betting on her." They led Graham Slater away. The courtroom exhaled. Lena sat very still for a moment and let the finality of it arrive, the verdict, the sentence, the fact of his diminishment from the immense operational threat of 7 weeks ago to a man in handcuffs being walked through a door by officers already thinking about their lunch. The gap between those two things was not satisfying in the way she might have expected. It was true and necessary and right. But it was not the clean resolution of a story with a comforting shape. Real things never were. Damon's hand found hers briefly, a single steady pressure, and then he released it and stood because the lawyers were waiting and the work, as it always did, continued. The civil cases resolved faster than the criminal ones, which was simply how the machinery of consequence worked when money was involved and the billable hours on both sides were high enough to motivate speed. Slater Capital's corporate structure collapsed progressively across 3 weeks, each subsidiary filing for protection. In sequence, the whole architecture Slater had built over 30 years, unwinding like a thread pulled from a sweater. The beneficial assets were absorbed. The shell companies were dissolved. The law firm in the Caymans quietly ceased operations, and its principal partners retained their own attorneys. Through civil discovery, Damon's legal team accessed Slater Capital's historical financial records and found what none of them had known about the pattern of exploitation that predated this particular conspiracy. By years, client accounts quietly leveraged against their owner's knowledge, the slow systemic extraction that had funded Slater's lifestyle and generated his power. The amount recovered from civil proceedings exceeded the amount that had nearly been stolen by a factor of 4. The Kellerman merger closed without incident 3 days after the verdict. Cross Industries' stock reached a record high. The financial press wrote extensively about Damon Cross's resilience and strategic vision. They mentioned Lena in precisely 2 articles, both describing her as a key witness. She found she didn't mind the invisibility. She had learned its uses. The scholarship fund was announced in late April, and when Damon showed her the documents in his office, Lena read through the full framework twice before she was certain she had understood it correctly. The Michael Hart Memorial Scholarship. Full ride living expenses included. 10 recipients per year, priority consideration for students from low-income backgrounds pursuing law degrees. The first cohort to enroll in September. "My father's name," she said. "His dream," Damon said simply. "And yours through him." This seemed like the right way to honor both. He paused. "Not just for you, for others who are standing where you stood." She didn't cry in his office. She held it together with the discipline of a person who had learned to process large emotional events in private. But she sat in her car in the parking structure for 45 minutes afterward, and the tears that came were the kind that arrived after something was finished. Not grief exactly, but the physical release of a pressure that had been building for years. Her father had believed in her before she believed in herself. He had seen the shape of what she could become, and held on to it through every difficulty, through the medical bills and the sleepless nights, and the days when she had been nothing but exhausted and had given him what he needed anyway. He had died before he could see it. But he had been right. He had always been right. The first scholarship recipients were announced 6 weeks later. 10 people, each one carrying their own version of the story she knew capable, committed, stopped at some point by the wrong combination of circumstances at the wrong moment. The acceptance letters were formal and careful, and beneath the formality, she could hear something she recognized, the particular disbelief of someone being told that the door they thought was closed was in fact open. She read all 10 of them alone in her apartment on a Sunday afternoon, and she cried again, less controlled this time, and she allowed herself to feel it without rushing through to the other side. The position Damon offered her was not what she had expected. Head of Ethics and Compliance, she had anticipated something in the legal department, a role that leveraged her specific knowledge of the Slater case, positioned her in the organization's existing structure. The ethics role was larger, more exposed, more genuinely consequential. "I'm not qualified," she said. "You're more qualified than anyone I could hire conventionally." He slid the position description across the desk. "You've seen what happens when a company's internal ethics infrastructure is absent or captured by the people it's meant to police. You've lived the consequences. That's not something they teach at any school." She read through it carefully. The role required her to push back against powerful people, to ask uncomfortable questions in comfortable rooms, to be the person in meetings who said the thing nobody wanted to hear. Her father had been that person on every job site for 20 years. He had pointed out when the work wasn't right, even when the timeline was tight and the client was impatient, even when it cost him contracts. He had been respected for it by the people who understood what integrity looked like in practice, and resented by the ones who didn't. He had never changed his approach. "I haven't finished my degree," she said. "Finish it. Ethics consultant in the interim part-time while you're in school. You build knowledge of the company, build relationships. When you graduate, the full position is yours. And if I decide it's not what I want, then you decide." He met her eyes. "I'm not asking for a commitment. I'm offering a path. What you do with it is yours." She accepted. Summer arrived in Manhattan the way it always did, abruptly. Completely. The spring coldness replaced overnight by heat that rose from the asphalt in visible waves and made the city feel simultaneously electric and exhausted. Lena's course load at Columbia was demanding in the way she had missed the kind of intellectual challenge that required full engagement rather than endurance. She sat in seminar rooms and participated in discussions and pulled straight A's on every exam, and felt for the first time in 3 years that she was using everything she had. Kara checked in regularly. Range time, she called it, the two of them, in a Queen's shooting range, where Kara worked with Lena on the particular kind of calm that made being in loud, threatening spaces less viscerally destabilizing. They didn't talk about the Foundry directly. They talked around it the way people who have been through something together talked about it, through context, through reference, through the occasional specific acknowledgement that was offered and then released. "You're better," Kara said one afternoon, watching Lena run through a target sequence. "At this, at everything." Kara ejected her magazine and began reloading. "First time you came in here, you flinched every time the person next to you fired. Now you don't even blink." "I learned from a professional." Kara's mouth twitched. "Don't get sentimental. I'm still billing Damon for my time." Reed came by the apartment every 2 weeks with updates on the ongoing proceedings against Slater's operational network, the tactical team, the complicit lawyers, the intermediaries who had connected the pieces. The case was far-reaching and would take years to fully resolve, but it was moving. Jonas appeared on Tuesday mornings for what he called security audits, and which functioned primarily as tutorials in digital self-protection. He had a teaching instinct beneath the technical persona, the ability to gauge understanding and adjust accordingly to find the analogy that made an abstract concept concrete. She learned from him how to recognize the architecture of manipulation, how to see structural patterns in seemingly random data, how to ask the question that a presentation was specifically designed to prevent you from asking. "You learn this faster than most of our security team," he said one Tuesday. "I'm motivated." "I noticed." He closed his laptop. "Can I ask you something?" "You're going to regardless." A brief smile. "That night at the Foundry, when you stopped the transfer under fire, were you scared?" "Yes." No hesitation. "Completely. But you kept going." "I had to." He nodded slowly. "I think about what I would have done, whether I would have just frozen." "You wouldn't have." She looked at him. You do what's necessary every day. You just do it through different tools. He thought about that. Different tools, he said. Same principle. Always thus. The evening that stays clearest in memory from that summer is a warm night in late May on the roof garden of Damon's penthouse. The kind of evening Manhattan produced occasionally, as though in apology for everything else. The temperature exactly right, the skyline, doing what it did when the light was low and the air was clear, which was to look like evidence that beauty was not only possible, but inevitable if you waited long enough. They were drinking wine. No performance, no occasion, just two people who had been through something together and were still figuring out what that meant, sitting with the city spread below them like an audience that wasn't watching. Lena had just finished her first week of full course load since coming back to Columbia. The week had been demanding and energizing in equal measure and had reminded her of something she had been in danger of forgetting, that she was genuinely good at this. Not just functional, not just surviving the material. Good at the thinking, at the argument, at the identification of the thing beneath the surface of a problem that was the actual thing to address. How does it feel? Damon asked. Being back. Like reclaiming something, she said. Like going back to a room I was asked to leave before the work was finished. And the work, does it feel worth doing? Now that you know how the system looks in practice, its limits. She thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. More, she said. Not less, because now I know what happens when it fails, which means I know exactly what we're building toward when we try to make it better. He was quiet. I've been thinking about Serena, he said. The name came out carefully. About what she said, that she did everything because she was afraid of going back to being nobody, that the fear was stronger than the ethics. I think about it too, Lena said. Do you understand it? Yes. No hesitation. I spent 3 years being invisible, working doubles, owing money, watching people I served not see my face. There were nights when I thought, if this was the rest of my life. She stopped. Let the honesty sit. I understand the fear of insignificance, the way it hollows you out over time. But you didn't make the same choice. I had a pen in my hand and 5 words I could write down. She looked at the skyline. That was my moment. That's all it was. A cheap ballpoint pen and a cocktail napkin and the specific geometry of a situation that made action possible. She paused. Serena's moments led her somewhere else. I don't know how much of that was character and how much was circumstances that ground her down in ways I can't fully account for from outside. I'm not sure the distinction matters now. She saved my life at the end, he said quietly. She did. Lena turned to look at him. And you kept your promise to her. You got him. That counts. The silence between them had the quality of something settled, not resolved, because the things that had happened between February and now could not be fully resolved, could only be carried forward and integrated, and eventually transformed into whatever wisdom the carrying produced. But settled. At rest in the way that things rested after a long effort had been completed. There's something I've been meaning to ask, Damon said. Ask. The morning after the Restaurant Third police interviewed different detective, he asked whether you would do it again knowing what it would cost you. He looked at her. You answered immediately. I remember. How? Lena thought about it the way the question deserved, without deflection, without the comfortable shorthand. Because my father believed in a version of me that I had almost given up on believing in myself, she said. And when I was standing in that service corridor with a pen in my hand, and 17 minutes on the clock when I chose to act rather than look away, I was the person he believed I was. Not almost that person. Actually that person. She held his gaze. Once you've been that person, you can't be anyone smaller. The choice makes you. And you have to keep being made by it, or you start shrinking back to what you were before. The silence that followed was long and good. You would have been proud, Damon said. I know. She let herself feel the truth of it, not the familiar ache of loss, but something warmer that coexisted with the grief. Pride traveling in one direction and gratitude traveling back, both of them real, both of them permanent. I know he would. They sat together as the sky completed its transition, the city becoming the thing it became at night, not less than itself, but differently beautiful, the darkness giving the lights their meaning. Below, somewhere in lower Manhattan, the Kellerman integration was running on schedule. The scholarship fund had received 400 applications for its first 10 spots. In a federal correctional facility in Pennsylvania, a man was beginning the long arithmetic of 35 years without the belief that had sustained him, the belief that he was exceptional, that the rules that governed other lives had never applied to his. None of it was clean. None of it was perfect. The story of what had happened at Aurelius on that February night would be examined and re-examined for years in courtrooms and academic papers, and wherever people gathered to discuss the ways that corporate power and human vulnerability and the refusal of ordinary people to look away converged into something that briefly illuminated what was usually kept dark. Lena raised her glass. "To second chances," she said. Damon raised his. "To the people who make them possible." Cha. On a crisp morning in early November, Lena Hart stood on the steps of Columbia Law School and let herself simply be there for a moment before going inside. The semester was well underway. Property law, constitutional theory, advanced corporate governance. She was carrying a full load and pulling marks that had attracted the attention of two professors who had suggested separately that she consider a publication in the spring. She had thanked them and said she'd think about it. And she was thinking about it, and the thinking felt pleasurable rather than anxious, which was new and worth noticing. Her phone buzzed. "A text from Damon Dinner tonight. Need your input on a new acquisition target. Questionable labor practices in the subsidiary structure. Want to flag before we get further in." She typed back, "That's literally what you pay me for, $700. Another text, this one from Kara Range Time Saturday. "New setup, I want you to try." And one from Jonas found a gap in the authentication protocol for the new client portal. "Coffee tomorrow, I want to walk you through it before I patch it." These were her people now. Her family forged in the specific and irreversible way that people became family when they had been through something real together. Not the family you were born into, not the family you chose in ordinary circumstances, but the family the fire made. She pocketed her phone and walked into the building. Students moved past her in the hallway, second years arguing a contracts case, a 1L looking terrified with a casebook, a group of third years in suits heading to an early class with the focused energy of people who could see the finish line. She was a third year herself now, 6 months from the bar exam, 18 months from standing in courtrooms doing the work that her father had always believed she would do. Her property law professor was writing case citations on the board when she settled into her seat in the third row. He glanced up, gave her the small nod of acknowledgement he had offered her since her return. Not the kind that drew attention, but the kind that conveyed a specific message. He knew what she had done. He knew who she was. He was glad to have her in the room. She opened her laptop. The lecture began. Lena took notes and asked questions and pushed back on a line of reasoning the professor offered in the second half of class with a counter-argument that she had been building since the reading 3 nights ago, and the professor considered it and said she had a point, and the seminar shifted direction slightly in the way it did when an actual idea entered the room. Outside the windows, November was asserting itself over the campus. The trees stripped the light clear and cold, the particular quality of autumn air that carried a sense of possibility in its chill. The semester was moving forward. The year was moving forward. Everything was moving forward. This was what her father had known. Not that the path would be clear, not that the obstacles would be proportionate to the effort, not that justice would come quickly or cleanly or without cost, but that the work was worth doing, that the person you were in the doing of it was the person you were building toward, that the choice every time in every room with every pen in every hand was to act or to look away, and that there was no neutral ground between those options, and that the accumulation of choices across a life was the life itself. She had been handed a choice in a service corridor in February with 17 minutes on the clock. She had written 5 words on a cocktail napkin and walked back into the room and changed what happened next. One choice, one pen, one person who had been told in the most explicit possible terms that she didn't matter, who had decided that the information she had mattered more than the danger to herself. That was all it had been. That was all any of it ever was. The lecture continued. Lena listened and learned and let herself believe clearly, without qualification for the first time in 3 years, that the future was not something that happened to her. It was something she was building one decision at a time in every room she entered with every tool she had. Her father's name was on a scholarship. 10 people this year, 10 more next year, each one carrying their own version of the story forward into whatever they would build with it. She was in a classroom doing the work she had abandoned and reclaimed. She was in a city that had tried to erase her and had failed. She was the person who couldn't be bought, couldn't be dismissed, couldn't be made invisible. And she was just getting started. Outside, the November sun broke through the clouds and crossed the campus in a broad, clean sweep of light, touching everything. It reached the old stone buildings and the newer glass ones, the students crossing the quad and the professor's notes on the board, and the open laptop on the desk in the third row where Lena Hart was writing the next line of the argument that would become her life's work. The pen moved. The story continued. 6 months after the trial, on an evening when the city was quietly doing what cities did best, holding millions of lives simultaneously without comment, Lena sat in an Uber on the way to a dinner that she was approximately 40 minutes late for, reading a case brief on her phone and mentally composing the argument she would need to make when she arrived. The dinner was with a partner at a firm she had decided 2 weeks ago that she was not going to work for. This was information the partner did not yet have. She had received the offer 3 days earlier, a first-year associate position with a compensation package that 12 months ago would have made her cry with relief. White shoe firm corporate litigation focused the kind of career track that had been visible to her from Columbia. Before her father got sick, the window she had believed was permanently closed. The offer was generous. It was prestigious. And it was entirely wrong for what she had decided she was going to do. She was going to finish her degree and take the position at Cross. She was going to build an ethics program that other companies would use as a template. She was going to be in rooms where powerful people made decisions, and she was going to ask the questions that needed asking, because she had learned what happened when those questions went unasked, and the answer was not something she was willing to accept as the inevitable state of affairs. The partner was a woman in her late 50s named Elaine Marsh, who had reached the top of a genuinely difficult profession through intelligence and endurance, and the particular combination of ambition and discipline that produced exceptional lawyers. Lena admired her. She was going to decline her offer. Both of these things were true simultaneously, and the maturity to hold them both simultaneously felt like evidence of something she had earned. Dinner took 2 hours. Elaine Marsh was, as expected, smart and perceptive, and entirely capable of recognizing a decision when she was in the presence of one. She did not try to change Lena's mind. She said at the end of the meal that she expected to be in rooms with Lena across the negotiating table within 5 years, and that she was looking forward to it. Lena walked out onto a warm June street feeling clear and purposeful and entirely at home in the decision she had made. The bar exam was in late July. She had been preparing for 6 months methodically, comprehensively, with the focused discipline of someone who understood that this particular test was less about intellectual ability than about the willingness to do the sustained, unglamorous work of preparation. She studied every morning from 5 to 7 before her consulting work at Cross began. She studied on weekends. She built outlines and tested herself and found her gaps and closed them and found the next gaps. 2 days before the exam, she went to her father's grave. It was in a cemetery in Queens that she had been visiting regularly since his death, a quiet place that felt removed from the density of the city around it, where the maintenance staff kept the grass trimmed and the paths clear. She brought flowers because she always brought flowers, and she stood at the headstone for a while without saying anything, which was also something she always did because the things she wanted to say to him were not things that needed to be converted to words. He knew. She was certain of that, in the way that she was certain of other things that couldn't be proven, that the choices you made under pressure revealed your character more accurately than anything that happened in calm conditions. That ordinary courage was more meaningful than dramatic courage because it was sustainable, that the life you chose to build in the aftermath of the worst thing that happened to you was the fullest expression of who you actually were. She put the flowers down. She stayed for a while. She went home and studied for 3 more hours and went to sleep. She passed the bar on her first attempt. She found out on a Thursday morning in October while she was at her desk at Cross, working through a vendor contract that had raised flags in the supply chain ethics review. Jonas sent her the notification by mistake. He had been monitoring the bar results page at her request. because she hadn't been able to bring herself to check it directly, and his text read simply, "You passed. Go call your people," in all capitals, which was entirely out of character for him, and therefore the most convincing possible confirmation that the result was real. She called Damon first. He said, "Of course you did." She said, "I know, but it's still good to hear." He said, "Dinner tonight. Actual celebration. No agenda." She said, "I'll be there at 7. She sat at her desk for a moment after she hung up and let herself feel the full weight of it, not triumph exactly, because triumph implied surprise, and she had known she would pass, had worked toward knowing it with everything she had. It was more like recognition. The moment when the image in the mirror finally matched the image you had been holding in your mind for years, the convergence of who you were with who you had always believed you could be. Her father had been right. He had always been right. She pressed her fingers flat against the desk surface for a moment, a small private gesture, and then she went back to the contract review because the work was ongoing and there was always more of it, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The full ethics position became official in January. The announcement was made internally first, then in a press release that mentioned Lena's role in the events of the preceding year in terms that were accurate without being sensational and emphasized what the role was designed to accomplish, rather than the personal narrative that surrounded it. She appreciated that. She had reached a place where the story of what had happened at Aurelius felt like a chapter important, formative, permanent, rather than the whole book. Her first week in the full role, she held 3 separate meetings with department heads at Cross, who had been told through various channels that the new ethics and compliance function had the direct ear of the CEO and genuine authority to delay or halt decisions that violated the company's ethical standards. 2 of the 3 meetings went smoothly, one with the senior vice president who had been at the company for 12 years and had the institutional confidence of someone who had survived multiple leadership transitions, became tense when Lena flagged a partnership structure that she believed created a conflict of interest that needed to be disclosed. "This partnership has been in place for 6 years, the VP said. "It has never been flagged before." "It should have been," Lena said, "and now it is. I'm not asking you to dissolve it. I'm asking you to disclose it properly and put a management framework in place that separates the conflicted decision-making from the unconflicted decision-making. That's a 20-day process, not a restructuring." The VP looked at her for a long moment with the particular expression of a man recalibrating a situation he had expected to be simple. "You're not going to let this go," he said. "No," she said. "I'm not." The disclosure was made within 3 weeks. The management framework was implemented. The VP stopped by her office the following month to tell her that the process had actually clarified the partnership's value, which had been obscured by the conflict structure, and that the partnership was likely going to be restructured to everyone's benefit. "You were right," he said, simply, without decoration. "I know," she said. "Thank you for letting the process work." He left. She sat back in her chair and thought about Graham Slater, who had built a 30-year career on the premise that the rules were obstacles to be managed rather than structures to be maintained, and about Serena Vale, who had convinced herself that the ends justified the means until the means became the end themselves, and about every board meeting and investment decision and casual ethical compromise that accumulated over years and decades until they became the ground condition for the kind of catastrophic failure that she had been standing in the middle of on a February night in Manhattan. The work was not glamorous. It did not involve running from gunmen or stopping transfers under fire. It involved sitting across tables from intelligent, experienced people and making arguments that were sometimes inconvenient and ensuring that inconvenience did not cause them to be ignored. It was exactly the right work. She was exactly the right person to do it. In the spring, 11 months after the foundry, Lena went back to Aurelius. Not for dinner. Not to prove anything. She went because she had unfinished business with Marco, the floor manager, who had been offered a position at a different restaurant during the chaos following the February incident and had taken it, and who had texted her 6 months ago to tell her he still had the server schedule from that night if she ever needed it for anything. She didn't need it, but she wanted to buy him a drink. They sat at the bar at 3 o'clock in the afternoon when the restaurant was between service and the room was quiet, and Marco, who was older than she had remembered, and who had the slightly dazed expression of a man still processing what had happened in a room he'd managed for 8 years, poured them both something cold. "That night," he said, "I've thought about it a lot. What would have happened if you hadn't—" "Don't," she said gently. "The thing that happened, happened. What we do from here is what matters." He looked at her for a moment, nodded slowly. "The scholarship," he said. "My daughter applied." "I know." Lena smiled. She was accepted. Marco put his hand over his eyes for a second, the gesture of a man managing something larger than he wanted to show in public. Then he composed himself and raised his glass. "Your father," he said, "he sounds like he was a good man." "The best man I knew," Lena said. They drank. She walked out of Aurelius into a spring afternoon that was warm enough to suggest summer without committing to it, and she stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the flow of the city people moving past on their individual errands, the ambient sound of traffic and conversation, and the particular compressed energy of a city that never fully slowed down, and she felt with a completeness she had not anticipated that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not finished, not arrived, not done with the difficulty or the work or the loss that was permanently part of her, but here, present, moving forward with the full weight of what she knew and the full commitment to what she was building. The city moved around her. She moved with it. One step, and then the next, and then the next, the way all journeys completed themselves, the way all stories reached their endings, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of ordinary choices made well over and over in the direction of the person you had decided to become. Her father's name was on a scholarship. His dream was alive in 10 people this year, and 10 more the next, and the year after that, forward into a future neither of them could see, but both of them had worked toward. Lena Hart, attorney at law, head of ethics and compliance at Cross Industries, walked down the street in the spring sunshine of a city she had helped protect and let herself be glad. Not for what had happened. Some of it was terrible, and the terrible parts would remain terrible, and she would carry them as part of the permanent furniture of her interior life, but for who she had become in the doing of it, for the 5 words on a napkin that had been the beginning of everything, for the pen in her pocket always wherever she went cheap, ballpoint the kind that cost nothing, the kind that could change everything if the person holding it had the willingness to write down the truth. The city hummed around her, the story continued, and Lena Hart, who had been invisible and had chosen not to remain so, walked forward into all of it steady and clear-eyed and entirely irreversibly herself.